Watership Down is a book written by British author Richard Adams. He died in 2016, I believe, and this was his first book ever, which is kind of surprising because it's widely considered a classic. It was first published in 1972, which is kind of late for a classic when you think about it. Normally, when you're thinking of English language classics, you're thinking of the Brontes, you're thinking of Dickens. So 1972 is really very, very late, but Watership Down is considered a classic all the same. A brief plot summary, Watership Down is, as you might guess from the title, about a ship that goes down in the water. Essentially what happens is a group of pirates are told by their captain to siege a British galleon, right? Like this massive trade ship. And a small group of them decide, hey, we're probably going to die because that British trade ship is probably very well defended by the British fleet. Turns out they were right, but there's too few of them to fully mutiny against the captain, but there are enough of them to steal the lifeboats and get the heck out of there. They're led by two brothers. One is called Fiver, because he's only got 5 fingers across both hands. And the other is called Nasal, because he's got a very nasally voice. And with them is a third, a minor character who is nonetheless quite major, and he's called Bigwig because he's got a ridiculous, sort of the 17th century equivalent of a pompadour, essentially. They lead a group of like a dozen pirates, and they sail away from the very doomed ship called the Sandalford. They make their way through dangerous waters. Some of them think they might die. Some of them try to double mutiny against Fiver and Nasal. But that kind of backfires on them when Bigwig, who's quite a voluminous character, he's a big guy and he's a very good fighter, backs up Nasal and Fiver. Everyone else sort of backs up and says, all right, fine, we'll let Nasal and Fiver lead us for the while, but if we die out here, we're going to have our revenge. Ultimately, they don't die. They make landfall on Florida. There, they have a lot of adventures. They free a slave from a local tyrant. He wants to go back to Africa, but he feels like he's indebted to these pirates. So eventually he helps them with their endeavor, which is they sort of want to get out of the whole piracy thing. They're not really keen on it. And they decide to make their own trading company. And that works very, very well for them. They're very successful inland. But when they try and purchase ships and expand their trading company to the rest of the Caribbean, they find that their efforts are hampered by a terrifying pirate captain called Woundwort. Woundwort has this epic, terrifying fleet that even the British Navy will try and steer away from. And essentially, Woundwort has this terrifying control over that little portion of the Caribbean where their hometown is located. In order to get out of their tyranny and to start up their business with new ships, these newly made tradesmen, alongside this slave that they freed, Kahar, who's still helping them for now, they decide to go back to their pirate roots and they hatch a very devious plan to, in one fell swoop, destroy Woundwort and to give themselves ships at the same time. What they're going to do is they're going to sneak into Woundwort's pirate cove as prospective new recruits. Then when they've been inducted more or less into the group, one night when everybody's sleeping, they're going to burn the place down. They're going to raise all the ships except for his flagship, which they're going to steal, ride the hell out of there, and make their own first flagship as part of their trading company. A daring plan. Does it work? Surprisingly, it does. There is a little hitch where the night they intended to do it, Woundwort sails out, right? So they're like, what the hell do we do? But if everything eventually works out and they leave Woundwort on the shore of his burning pirate cove, looking at them thinking, oh, I'm gonna kill those bastards, right? And he's giving them the stink eye with his one eye, because obviously he's got an eye patch on, because he's a pirate. Eventually, though, the slave owner, who used to own, or rather I should say, he thought he owned Kahar, right? Because people can't actually own other people. This guy's called Campion, and he realizes that the guys who destroyed Woundwort's pirate cove are these guys who also screwed up his life. So he goes to Woundwort and he says, listen, I've got ships of my own. I will give them to you if you can kill these people and give me back my slave. Campion would literally rather see his town destroyed than to allow these people to embarrass him the way they have. When he's offered this choice, the narrator of the book says this: there was offered to Captain Woundwort the opportunity to show whether he was really the leader of vision and genius which he believed himself to be, or whether he was no more than a tyrant with the courage and cunning of a rabbit. The choice being, will he find some clever piratey way of taking back his ship, or will he accept Campion's plea and simply destroy the whole fucking place just because he has been slighted against? And of course he decides the second because he's not really a leader of vision and genius as he wants to be. Campion and Woundwort team up to lay siege on this little peaceful Floridian town. Nasal Fiver, Bigwig. Kehar at this point has left to Africa because he's told by these pirates that his debt is paid. But anyway, so these pirates, these new tradesmen, have to figure out a way to defeat the most terrifying pirates in the Caribbean. Do they succeed? Well, maybe you ought to read the book and find out for yourself. At which point you will of course realize that I have been making this story up. This is not what Watership Down is about, but it is very much the story of Watership Down all the same, just recontextualized into 17th century Caribbean piracy. That's the word. Recontextualized from, well actually, a story about rabbits. Well, yes, so I've been lying to you. The book is not about a ship that goes down in the water. It's about a down, which is sort of like a hill. And the hill is called Watership. Other than that, though, I think I did a really good job basically reinterpreting the story of Watership Down while presenting it in a context that better specifies the tone and the character of the book. It's very gritty and violent in a lot of places, and you wouldn't expect it from what is classed as a children's book about rabbits. It's not a children's book. I mean, children can read it, I guess. They will not do well, as I know for myself, because I read this as a kid. I'll talk about that more later. Really, it's not a children's book at all. It is a book written by an adult, for adults, nonetheless to read to children, I guess for like bedtime reading or whatever. In just that way, I want to read Watership Down to you guys, not as though you were children, but as though you were adults. There's a lot of interesting ideas in this book that are played down because they're presented through the perspective of rabbits. So there is a superficial childishness to it. But if we look through it, if we look past it, as I intend to do today, I think we'll find some very cool ideas that are being explored in this novel, as you would expect from an English language classic. For that purpose, I've chosen one of my favorite sections of this book, which is the second half of the first part. There are 4 parts, so this is roughly an eighth of the book, both in terms of page numbers as well as just from that description I gave you there. And as much as Woundwort and El-ahrairah are the more memorable and substantial parts of the book, I think this introductory inter-rabbit conflict in part 1 is one of the most revealing and gripping parts of the book that first reveals to you what Richard Adams is trying to do with writing about rabbits in this way. Within the context of my pirate story, these rabbits have just made landfall on Florida after a week, tied together, stranded in the oceans, not seeing any land, wondering if they're gonna die of starvation or of thirst out here, and finally they feel the sand beneath their feet. Finally they realize they're gonna be okay. They're just having fun, essentially, and you'll definitely hear that once we get into this chapter. Chapter 12, The Stranger in the Field. Nevertheless, even in a crowded warren, visitors in the form of young rabbits seeking desirable dry quarters may be tolerated, and if powerful enough, they may obtain and hold a place. R. M. Lockley, The Private Life of the Rabbit. To come to the end of a time of anxiety and fear, to feel the cloud that hung over us lift and disperse, the cloud that dulled the heart and made happiness no more than a memory. This at least is one joy that must have been known by almost every living creature. Here is a boy who was waiting to be punished, but then, unexpectedly, he finds that his fault has been overlooked or forgiven, and at once the world reappears in brilliant colors full of delightful prospects. Here is a soldier who was waiting, with a heavy heart, to suffer and die in battle, but suddenly the luck is changed. There is news. The war is over, and everyone bursts out singing. He will go home after all. The sparrows in the ploughland were crouching in terror of the kestrel, but she has gone, and they fly pell-mell up the hedgerow, frisking, chattering, and perching where they will. The bitter winter had all the country in its grip. The hares on the downs, stupid and torpid with cold, were resigned to sinking further and further into the freezing heart of snow and silence. But now, who would have dreamt it? The thaw is trickling, the great tit is ringing his bell from the top of a bare lime tree, the earth is scented, and the hares bound and skip in the warm wind. Hopelessness and reluctance are blown away like a fog, and the dumb solitude where they crept, a place desolate as a crack in the ground, opens like a rose and stretches to the hills and the sky. The tired rabbits fed and basked in the sunny meadow as though they had come no further than from the bank at the edge of the nearby copse. The heather and the stumbling darkness were forgotten as though the sunrise had melted them. Bigwig and Hawkbit chased each other through the long grass. Speedwell jumped over the little brook that ran down the middle of the field, and when Acorn tried to follow him and fell short, Silver joked with him as he scrambled out and rolled him in a patch of dead oak leaves until he was dry. As the sun rose higher, shortening the shadows and drawing the dew from the grass, most of the rabbits came wandering back to the sun-flecked shade among the cow parsley along the edge of the ditch. Here, Hazel and Fiver were sitting with Dandelion under a flowering wild cherry. The white petals spun down around them, covering the grass and speckling their fur, while 30 feet above, a thrush sang, cherry-dew, knee-deep, knee-deep, knee-deep." "Well, this is the place all right, isn't it, Hazel?" said Dandelion lazily. "I suppose we'd better start having a look along the banks soon, although I must say I'm in no particular hurry. But I've got an idea it may be going to rain before much longer." Fiver looked as though he were about to speak, but then shook his ears and turned to nibbling at a dandelion. "That looks like a good bank, along the edge of the trees up there," answered Hazel. "What do you say, Fiver? Shall we go up there now, or shall we wait a bit longer?" Fiver hesitated and then replied, "Well, just as you think, Hazel." "Well, there's no need to do any serious digging, is there?" said Bigwig. "That sort of thing's all right for does, but not for us." "Still, we'd better make 1 or 2 scrapes, don't you think?" said Hazel. "Something to give us shelter at a pinch. Let's go up to the copse and look around. We might as well take our time and make quite sure where we'd like to have them. We don't want to have to do the work twice." "Yes, that's the style," said Bigwig. "And while you're doing that, I'll take Silver and Buckthorn here and have a run down the fields beyond, just to get the lie of the land and make sure there isn't anything dangerous." The 3 explorers set off beside the brook, while Hazel led the other rabbits across the field and up to the edge of the woodland. They went slowly along the foot of the bank, pushing in and out of the clumps of red campion and ragged robin. From time to time, one or another would begin to scrape in the gravelly bank, or venture a little way in among the trees and nut bushes to scuffle in the leaf mould. After they had been searching and moving on quietly for some time, they reached a place from which they could see that the field below them broadened out. Both on their own side and opposite, the wood edges curved outwards, away from the brook. They also noticed the roofs of a farm, but some distance off. Hazel stopped and they gathered round him. "I don't think it makes much difference where we do a bit of scratching," he said. "It's all good so far as I can see. Not the slightest trace of El-ahrairah. No scent, or tracks, or droppings. That seems unusual, but it may be just that the home warren attracted more El-ahrairah than other places. Anyway, we ought to do well here. Now I'll tell you what seems the right thing to me. Let's go back a little way, between the woods, and have a scratch near that oak tree there, just by that white patch of stitchwort. I know the farm's a long way off, but there's no point in being nearer to it than we need. And if we're fairly close to the wood opposite, the trees will help to break the wind a bit in winter." "Splendid," said Blackberry. "It's going to cloud over, do you see? Rain before sunset, and we'll be in shelter. Well, let's make a start. Oh, look, there's Bigwig coming back along the bottom, and the other 2 with him." The 3 rabbits were returning down the bank of the stream and had not yet seen Hazel and the others. They passed below them, into the narrower part of the field between the 2 copses, and it was not until Acorn had been sent halfway down the slope to attract their attention that they turned and came back up to the ditch. "I don't think there's going to be much trouble to us here, Hazel," said Bigwig. "The farm's a good way away, and the fields between don't show any signs of El-ahrairah at all. There's a man track, in fact there are several, and they look as though they were used a good deal. Scent's fresh, and there are the ends of those little white sticks that they burn in their mouths. But that's all for the best, I reckon. We keep away from the men, and the men frighten the El-ahrairah away." "Why do the men come, do you suppose?" asked Fiver. "Who knows why men do anything? They may drive cows or sheep in the fields, or cut wood in the copses, What does it matter? I'd rather dodge a man than a stoat or a fox." "Well, that's fine," said Hazel. "You found out a lot, Bigwig, and all to the good. We were just going to make some scrapes along the bank there. We'd better start. The rain won't be long now, if I know anything about it." Buck rabbits, on their own, seldom or never go in for serious digging. This is the natural job of a doe, making a home for her litter before they are born, and then her buck helps her. All the same, solitary bucks, if they can find no existing holes to make use of, will sometimes scratch out short tunnels for shelter, although it is not work that they tackle at all seriously. During the morning, the digging proceeded in a light-hearted and intermittent way. The bank on each side of the oak tree was bare and consisted of a light, gravelly soil. There were several false starts and fresh choices, but by knee frith they had 3 scrapes of a sort. Hazel, watching, lent help here and there and encouraged the others. Every so often he slipped back to look out over the field and make sure that all was safe. Only Fiver remained solitary. He took no part in the digging, but squatted on the edge of the ditch, fidgeting backwards and forwards, sometimes nibbling, and then starting up suddenly as though he could hear some sound in the wood. After speaking to him once or twice and receiving no reply, Hazel thought it best to let him alone. The next time he left the digging, he kept away from Fiver and sat looking at the bank, as though entirely concerned with the work. A little while after Neefrith, the sky clouded over thickly. The light grew dull, and they could smell rain approaching from the west. The blue tit that had been swinging on a bramble singing, "Hi-ho, go and get another bit of moss," stopped his acrobatics and flew into the wood. Hazel was just wondering whether it would be worthwhile starting a side passage to link Bigwig's hole to Dandelion's, when he felt a stamp of warning from somewhere close by. He turned quickly. It was Fiver who had stamped, and he was now staring intently across the field. Beside a tussock of grass, a little way outside the opposite copse, a rabbit was sitting and gazing at them. Its ears were erect, and it was evidently giving them the full attention of sight, smell, and hearing. Hazel rose on his hind legs, paused, and then sat back on his haunches, in full view. The other rabbits remained motionless. Hazel, never taking his eyes off it, heard 3 or 4 of the others coming up behind him. After a moment he said, "Blackberry?" "He's down the hole," replied Pipkin. "Go and get him." Still the strange rabbit made no move. The wind rose, and the long grass began to flutter and ripple in the dip between them. From behind, Blackberry said, "You wanted me, Hazel." "I'm going over to speak to that rabbit," said Hazel. "I want you to come with me." "Can I come?" asked Pipkin. "No, Hlauru. We don't want to frighten him. 3's too many." "Be careful," said Buckthorn, as Hazel and Blackberry set off down the slope. "He may not be the only one." At several points the brook was narrow, not much wider than a rabbit run. They jumped it and went up the opposite slope. "Just behave as if we were back at home," said Hazel. "I don't see how it can be a trap, and anyway, we can always run." As they approached, the other rabbits kept still and watched them intently. They could see now that he was a big fellow, sleek and handsome. His fur shone, and his claws and teeth were in perfect condition. Nevertheless, he did not seem aggressive. On the contrary, there was a curious, rather unnatural gentleness about the way in which he waited for them to come nearer. They stopped and looked at him from a little distance. "I don't think he's dangerous," whispered Blackberry. "I'll go up to him first if you like." "We'll both go," replied Hazel. But at this moment the other rabbit came towards them of his own accord. He and Hazel touched their noses together, sniffing and questioning silently. The stranger had an unusual smell, but it was certainly not unpleasant. It gave Hazel an impression of good feeding, of health, and of a certain indolence, as though the other came from some rich, prosperous country where he himself had never been. He had the air of an aristocrat, and as he turned to gaze at Blackberry from his great brown eyes, Hazel began to see himself as a ragged wanderer, leader of a band of vagabonds. He had not meant to be the first to speak, but something in the other's silence compelled him. "We've come over the heather," he said. The other rabbit made no reply, but his look was not that of an enemy. His demeanor had a kind of melancholy which was perplexing. "Do you live here?" asked Hazel after a pause. "Yes," replied the other rabbit, and then added, "We saw you come." "We mean to live here too," said Hazel firmly. The other rabbit showed no concern. He paused and then answered, "Why not? We supposed you would. But I don't think there are enough of you, are there, to live very comfortably on your own?" Hazel felt puzzled. Apparently the stranger was not worried by the news that they meant to stay. How big was his warren? Where was it? How many rabbits were concealed in the copse and watching them now? Were they likely to be attacked? The stranger's manner told nothing. He seemed detached, almost bored, but perfectly friendly. His lassitude, his great size and beautiful, well-groomed appearance, his unhurried air of having all he wanted and of being unaffected by the newcomers one way or the other, all these presented Hazel with a problem unlike anything he had had to deal with before. If there was some kind of trick, he had no idea what it might be. He decided that he himself, at any rate, would be perfectly candid and plain. "There are enough of us to protect ourselves," he said. "We don't want to make enemies, but if we meet with any kind of interference—" The other interrupted smoothly. "Don't get upset. You're all very welcome. If you're going back now, I'll come over with you. That is, unless you have any objection." He set off down the slope. Hazel and Blackberry, after looking at each other for a moment, caught him up and went beside him. He moved easily, without haste, and showed less caution than they in crossing the field. Hazel felt more mystified than ever. The other rabbit evidently had no fear that they might set upon him, Hrair to one, and kill him. He was ready to go alone among a crowd of suspicious strangers, but what he stood to gain from this risk it was impossible to guess. Perhaps, thought Hazel wryly, teeth and claws would make no impression on that great, firm body and shining pelt. When they reached the ditch, all the other rabbits were squatting together, watching their approach. Hazel stopped in front of them but did not know what to say. If the stranger had not been there, he would have given them an account of what had happened. If Blackberry and he had driven the stranger across the field by force, he could have handed him over for safekeeping to Bigwig or Silver, but to have him sitting beside him, looking his followers over in silence and courteously waiting for someone else to speak first, this was a situation beyond Hazel's experience. It was Bigwig, straightforward and blunt as always, who broke the tension. "Who is this Hazel?" he said. "Why has he come back with you?" "I don't know," answered Hazel, trying to look frank and feeling foolish. "He came of his own accord." "Well, we'd better ask him then," said Bigwig with something like a sneer. He came close to the stranger and sniffed, as Hazel had done. He too was evidently affected by the peculiar smell of prosperity, for he paused as though in uncertainty. Then, with a rough, abrupt air, he said, "Who are you, and what do you want?" "My name is Cowslip," said the other. "I don't want anything. I hear you've come a long way." "Perhaps we have," said Bigwig. "We know how to defend ourselves too." "I'm sure you do," said Cowslip, looking round at the mud-stained, bedraggled rabbits with an air of being too polite to comment. "But it can be hard to defend oneself against the weather. There's going to be rain, and I don't think your scrapes are finished." He looked at Bigwig, as though waiting for him to ask another question. Bigwig seemed confused. Clearly he could make no more of the situation than Hazel. There was silence, except for the sound of the rising wind. Above them, the branches of the oak tree were beginning to creak and sway. Suddenly, Fiver came forward. "We don't understand you," he said. "It's best to say so and try to get things clear. Can we trust you? Are there many other rabbits here? Those are the things we want to know." Cowslip showed no more concern at Fiver's tense manner than he had at anything that had gone before. He drew a forepaw down the back of one ear and then replied, "I think you're puzzling yourselves unnecessarily. But if you want the answers to your questions, then I'd say, yes, you can trust us. We don't want to drive you away. And there is a warren here, but not as big a one as we would like. Why should we want to hurt you? There's plenty of grass, surely?" In spite of his strange, clouded manner, he spoke so reasonably that Hazel felt rather ashamed. "We've been through a lot of danger," he said. "Everything new seems like danger to us. After all, you might be afraid that we were coming to take your doughs or to turn you out of your holes." Cowslip listened gravely. Then he answered, "Well, as to the holes, that was something I thought I might mention. These scrapes aren't very deep or comfortable, are they? And although they're facing out of the wind now, you ought to know that this isn't the usual wind we get here. It's blowing up this rain from the south. We usually have a west wind, and it'll go straight into those holes. There are plenty of empty burrows in our warren, and if you want to come across, you'll be welcome. And now, if you'll excuse me, I won't stay any longer. I hate the rain. The warren is round the corner of the wood opposite." He ran down the slope and over the brook. They watched him leap the bank of the further copse and disappear through the green bracken. The first scatters of rain were beginning to fall, pattering into the oak leaves and pricking the bare, pink skin inside their ears. "Fine big fellow, isn't he?" said Buckthorn. "He doesn't look as though he had much to bother about living here." "What should we do, Hazel, do you think?" asked Silver. "It's true what he said, isn't it? These scrapes, well, we can crouch in them out of the weather, but no more than that. And as we can't all get into one, we shall have to split up." "We'll join them together," said Hazel. "And while we're doing that, I'd like to talk about what he said. Fiver, Bigwig, Blackberry, can you come with me? The rest of you split how you like." The new hole was short, narrow, and rough. There was no room for 2 rabbits to pass. 4 were like beans in a pod. For the first time, Hazel began to realize how much they had left behind. The holes and tunnels of an old warren become smooth, reassuring, and comfortable with use. There are no snags or rough corners. Every length smells of rabbits, of that great, indestructible flood of rabbitry in which each one is carried along, sure-footed and safe. The heavy work has all been done by countless great-grandmothers and their mates. All the faults have been put right, and everything in use is of proved value. The rain drains easily, and even the wind of midwinter cannot penetrate the deeper burrows. Not one of Hazel's rabbits had ever played any part in real digging. The work they had done that morning was trifling, and all they had to show for it was rough shelter and little comforts. There is nothing like bad weather to reveal the shortcomings of a dwelling, particularly if it is too small. You are, as they say, stuck with it, and have leisure to feel all its peculiar irritations and discomforts. Bigwig, with his usual brisk energy, set to work. Hazel, however, returned and sat pensive at the lip of the hole, looking out at the silent, rippling veils of rain that drifted across and across the little valley between the 2 copses. Closer before his nose, every blade of grass, every bracken frond was bent, dripping and glistening. The smell of last year's oak leaves filled the air. It had turned chilly. Across the field, the bloom of the cherry tree, under which they had sat that morning, hung sodden and spoiled. While Hazel gazed, the wind slowly veered round into the west, as Cowslip had said it would, and brought the rain driving into the mouth of the hole. He backed down and rejoined the others. The pattering and whispering of the rain sounded softly but distinctly outside. The fields and woods were shut in under it, emptied and subdued. The insect life of the leaves and grass was stilled. The thrush should have been singing, but Hazel could hear no thrush. He and his companions were a muddy handful of scratchers, crouching in a narrow, draughty pit in lonely country. They were not out of the weather. They were waiting uncomfortably for the weather to change. "Blackberry," said Hazel, "what did you think of our visitor, and how would you like to go to his warren?" "Well," replied Blackberry, "what I think is this. There's no way of finding out whether he's to be trusted except to try it. He seemed friendly, but then if a lot of rabbits were afraid of some newcomers and wanted to deceive them, get them down a hole and attack them, they'd start, wouldn't they, by sending someone who was plausible. They might want to kill us, but then again, as he said, there's plenty of grass. And as for turning them out or taking their doughs, If they're all up to his size and weight, they've nothing to fear from a crowd like us. They must have seen us come. We were tired. Surely that was the time to attack us. Or while we were separated, before we began digging. But they didn't. I reckon they're more likely to be friendly than otherwise. There's only one thing beats me. What do they stand to get from asking us to join their warren? Fools attract allele by being easy prey, said Bigwig, cleaning the mud out of his whiskers and blowing through his long front teeth. And we're fools until we've learnt to live here. Safer to teach us, perhaps. I don't know, give it up. But I'm not afraid to go and find out. If they do try any tricks, they'll find I know a few as well. I wouldn't mind taking a chance to sleep somewhere more comfortable than this. We haven't slept since yesterday afternoon. Fiver? I think we ought to have nothing to do with that rabbit or his warren. We ought to leave this place at once. But what's the good of talking? Cold and damp. Hazel felt impatient. He had always been accustomed to rely on Fiver, and now, when he really needed him, he was letting them down. Blackberry's reasoning had been first-rate, and Bigwig had at least shown which way any sound-hearted rabbit would be likely to lean. Apparently the only contribution Fiver could make was this beetle-spirited vaporing. He tried to remember that Fiver was undersized, and that they had had an anxious time, and were all wary. At this moment the soil at the far end of the burrow began to crumble inwards. Then it fell away, and Silver's head and front paws appeared. "Here we are," said Silver cheerfully. "We've done what you wanted, Hazel, and Buckthorn's through next door. But what I'd like to know is, what about, what's his name, Cowpat? No, Cowslip. Are we going to his warren or not? Surely we're not going to sit cowering in this place because we're frightened to go and see him. Whatever will he think of us?" "I'll tell you," said Dandelion from over his shoulder. "If he's not honest, he'll know we're afraid to come. And if he is, he'll think we're suspicious, cowardly skulkers. If we're going to live in these fields, we'll have to get on terms with his lot sooner or later, and it goes against the grain to hang about and admit we daren't visit them." "I don't know how many of them there are," said Silver, "but we're quite a crowd. Anyway, I hate the idea of just keeping away. Since when have rabbits been allele? Old Cowslip wasn't afraid to come into the middle of us, was he?" "Very well," said Hazel. "That's how I feel myself. I just wanted to know whether you did. Would you like Bigwig and me to go over there first, by ourselves, and report back?" "No," said Silver. "Let's all go. If we're going at all, for Frith's sake, let's do it as though we weren't afraid. What do you say, Dandelion?" "I think you're right." "Then we'll go now," said Hazel. "Get the others, and follow me." Outside, in the thickening light of the late afternoon, with the rain trickling into his eyes and under his scut, he watched them as they joined him. Blackberry, alert and intelligent, looking first up and then down the ditch before he crossed it. Bigwig, cheerful at the prospect of action. The steady, reliable Silver. Dandelion, the dashing storyteller, so eager to be off that he jumped the ditch and ran a little way into the field before stopping to wait for the rest. Buckthorn, perhaps the most sensible and staunch of them all. Pipkin, who looked round for Hazel and then came over to wait beside him. Acorn, Hawkbit, and Speedwell, decent enough rank and filers as long as they were not pushed beyond their limits. Last of all came Fiver, dejected and reluctant as a sparrow in the frost. As Hazel turned from the hole, the clouds in the west broke slightly, and there was a sudden dazzle of watery, pale gold light. "Oh, El-ahrairah," thought Hazel. "These are rabbits we're going to meet. You know them as well as you know us. Let it be the right thing that I'm doing." "Now brace up, Fiver," he said aloud. "We're waiting for you, and getting wetter every moment." A soaking bumblebee crawled over a thistle bloom, vibrated its wings for a few seconds, and then flew away down the field. Hazel followed, leaving a dark track behind him over the silvered grass. And that's chapter 12. You might be wondering why I've set out on this 3-hour endeavor to record 6 chapters of Watership Down and put it all into a single video. Well, this is in all honesty, a mic test, right? Proper mic test that I haven't done for quite a long time now. I've read a lot of stuff, and a lot of that has gone into the mic test playlist, but they haven't been mic tests. They've just been me wanting to read things. This is genuinely, I'm changing the position of the microphone, I'm changing the equalization settings, I'm changing the gain on the microphone on Audacity here. I'm also changing certain effects that I use, for example, reverb, which right now you shouldn't be hearing, because every chapter and every preamble to every chapter, I'm trying out different settings. You are hearing 6 different settings here. You probably won't recognize it though, because you guys are very, very nice, which means you guys are absolutely useless at telling me which settings sound best. It seems that all of my audience always says, hey, you sound great no matter what, even though I can tell you that over the summer, for example, when I was reading the Jordan Peterson stuff, it did not sound good. It did not sound good. I had to really rework the equalization settings completely in order to make it sound remotely as clear as it does right now. And even then, hopefully I can make it sound clearer by experimenting in this way. This is not the motivation. The actual motivation is I want to talk about Watership Down, but this is just a very convenient moment for me to check out equalization settings, especially as I go into the new year and I go to the second half of George Joestar. I want to make sure that I have a very consistent sound that makes me sound actually very, very good. The other thing is, because of George Joestar, you'll notice that the 2 narrators in that book are both British, right? There's Jorge Joestar, who speaks in a much more restrained and soft manner. And then there's Georgie, who's got this really irritating voice that I picked up. It's sort of a cross between David Bowie and John Lennon. I don't really know which one I'm angling at any moment, but at least, you know, that keeps me on my toes, and I'm always having to concentrate on how I'm doing his voice. It's a very fun one to do, but quite stressful, because I don't know if I'm doing a Georgie voice at any given moment, or if I'm just doing a really bad John Lennon impersonation. What this means, though, is because every time I read lately, I have had to do a British accent, I've actually started automatically going to a British accent whenever I read, instead of just reading in my normal voice. So in order to combat that, I'm ready for combat. In order to combat that, sorry, that was unnecessary. In order to combat that, I'm just going to read, yes, 3 hours of Watership Down in my own voice, and hopefully by the end of it, it will return as a natural impulse to just use my normal voice and not put on a British accent when I have to read a book. I've only read chapter 12 so far, and that was like a 30-minute reading, so 6 times 0.5 hours makes for a 3-hour reading. So let's not waste too much time ambling, and let's get straight to the reading itself. Chapter 13, Hospitality. In the afternoon they came unto a land, in which it seemed always afternoon. All round the coast the languid air did swoon, breathing like one that hath a weary dream. Tennyson, The Lotus Eaters. The corner of the opposite wood turned out to be an acute point. Beyond it, the ditch and trees curved back again in a re-entrance, so that the field formed a bay with a bank running all the way around. It was evident now why Cowslip, when he left them, had gone among the trees. He had simply run in a direct line from their holes to his own, passing on his way through the narrow strip of woodland that lay between. Indeed, as Hazel turned the point and stopped to look about him, he could see the place where Cowslip must have come out. A clear rabbit track led from the bracken, under the fence, and into the field. In the bank on the further side of the bay, the rabbit holes were plain to see, showing dark and distinct in the bare ground. It was as conspicuous a warren as could well be imagined. "Sky above us," said Bigwig. "Every living creature for miles must know that's there. Look at all the tracks in the grass, too. Do you think they sing in the morning like the thrushes?" "Perhaps they're too secure to bother about concealing themselves," said Blackberry. "After all, the home warren was fairly plain to be seen." "Yes, but not like that. A couple of hoodoodeal could go down some of those holes." "So could I," said Dandelion. "I'm getting dreadfully wet." As they approached, a big rabbit appeared over the edge of the ditch, looked at them quickly, and vanished into the bank. A few moments later, 2 others came out and waited for them. They, too, were sleek and unusually large. "A rabbit called Cowslip offered us shelter here," said Hazel. "Perhaps you know that he came to see us." Both rabbits together made a curious dancing movement of the head and front paws. Apart from sniffing, as Hazel and Cowslip had done when they met, formal gestures, except between mating rabbits, were unknown to Hazel and his companions. They felt mystified and slightly ill at ease. The dancers paused, evidently waiting for some acknowledgement or reciprocal gesture, but there was none. "Cowslip is in the great burrow," said one of them at length. "Would you like to follow us there?" "How many of us?" asked Hazel. "Why, all of you," answered the other, surprised. "You don't want to stay out in the rain, do you?" Hazel had supposed that he and one or two of his comrades would be taken to see the chief rabbit, who would probably not be Cowslip, since Cowslip had come to see them unattended, in his burrow, after which they would all be given different places to go to. It was this separation of which he had been afraid. He now realized with astonishment that there was apparently a part of the warren underground which was big enough to contain all of them together. He felt so curious to visit it that he did not stop to make any detailed arrangements about the order in which they should go down. However, he put Pipkin immediately behind him. "It'll warm his little heart for once," he thought. "And if the leaders do get attacked, I suppose we can spare him easier than some." Bigwig he asked to bring up the rear. "If there's any trouble, get out of it," he said, "and take as many you can with you." Then he followed their guides into one of the holes in the bank. The run was broad, smooth, and dry. It was obviously a highway, for the other runs branched off it in all directions. The rabbits in front went fast, and Hazel had little time to sniff about as he followed. Suddenly he checked. He had come into an open place. His whiskers could feel no earth in front, and none was near his sides. There was a good deal of air ahead of him. He could feel it moving. And there was a considerable space above his head. Also, there were several rabbits near him. It had not occurred to him that there would be a place underground where he would be exposed on 3 sides. He backed quickly and felt Pipkin at his tail. "What a fool I was," he thought. "Why didn't I put Silver there?" At this moment he heard Cowslip speaking. He jumped, for he could tell that he was some way away. The size of the place must be immense. "Is that you, Hazel?" said Cowslip. "You're welcome, and so are your friends. We're glad you've come." No human beings, except the courageous and experienced blind, are able to sense much in a strange place where they cannot see, but with rabbits it is otherwise. They spend half their lives underground in darkness, or near darkness, and touch, smell, and hearing convey as much or more to them than sight. Hazel now had the clearest knowledge of where he was. He would have recognized the place if he had left at once and come back 6 months later. He was at one end of the largest burrow he had ever been in, sandy, warm, and dry, with a hard, bare floor. There were several tree roots running across the roof, and it was these that supported the unusual span. There was a great number of rabbits in the place, many more than he was bringing. All had the same rich, opulent smell as Cowslip. Cowslip himself was at the other end of the hall, and Hazel realized that he was waiting for him to reply. His own companions were still coming out of the entrance burrow one by one, and there was a good deal of scrabbling and shuffling. He wondered if he ought to be very formal. Whether or not he could call himself a chief rabbit, he had no experience of this sort of thing. The El-ahrairah would no doubt have risen to the occasion perfectly. He did not want to appear at a loss, or to let his followers down. He decided that it would be best to be plain and friendly. After all, there would be plenty of time, as they settled down in the warren, to show these strangers that they were as good as themselves, without risking trouble by putting on airs at the start. "We're glad to be out of the bad weather," he said. "We're like all rabbits, happiest in a crowd. When you came over to see us in the field, Cowslip, you said your warren wasn't large, but judging by the holes we saw along the bank, it must be what we'd reckon a fine big one." As he finished, he sensed that Bigwig had just entered the hall, and knew that they were all together again. The stranger rabbits seemed slightly disconcerted by his little speech, and he felt that for some reason or other he had not struck the right note in complimenting them on their numbers. Perhaps there were not very many of them, after all. Had there been disease? There was no smell or sign of it. These were the biggest and healthiest rabbits he had ever met. Perhaps their fidgeting and silence had nothing to do with what he said. Perhaps it was simply that he had not spoken very well, being new to it, and they felt that he was not up to their fine ways. Never mind, he thought. After last night, I'm sure of my own lot. We wouldn't be here at all if we weren't handy in a pinch. These other fellows will just have to get to know us. They don't seem to dislike us anyway. There were no more speeches. Rabbits have their own conventions and formalities, but these are few and short by human standards. If Hazel had been a human being, he would have been expected to introduce his companions one by one, and no doubt each would have been taken in charge as a guest by one of their hosts. In the great burrow, however, things happened differently. The rabbits mingled, naturally. They did not talk for talking's sake, in the artificial manner that human beings, and sometimes even their dogs and cats, do. But this did not mean that they were not communicating, merely that they were not communicating by talking. All over the burrow, both the newcomers and those who were at home were accustoming themselves to each other in their own way and their own time, getting to know what the strangers smelt like, how they moved, how they breathed, how they scratched, the feel of their rhythms and pulses. These were the topics and subjects of discussion carried on without the need of speech. To a greater extent than a human in a similar gathering, each rabbit, as he pursued his own fragment, was sensitive to the trend of the whole. After a time, all knew that the concourse was not going to turn sour or break up in a fight. Just as a battle begins in a state of equilibrium between the two sides, which gradually alters one way or the other, until it is clear that the balance has tilted so far that the issue can no longer be in doubt. So this gathering of rabbits in the dark, beginning with hesitant approaches, silences, pauses, movements, crouching side by side, and all manner of tentative appraisals, slowly moved like a hemisphere of the world into summer, to a warmer, brighter region of mutual liking and approval, until all felt sure that they had nothing to fear. Pipkin, some way away from Hazel, crouched at his ease between two huge rabbits who could have broken his back in a second, while Buckthorn and Cowslip started a playful scuffle, nipping each other like kittens, and then breaking off to comb their ears in a comical pretense of sudden gravity. Only Fiver sat alone and apart. He seemed either ill or very much depressed, and the strangers avoided him instinctively. The knowledge that the gathering was safely round the corner came to Hazel in the form of a recollection of Silver's head and paws breaking through gravel. At once he felt warm and relaxed. He had already crossed the whole length of the hall and was pressed close to two rabbits, a buck and doe, each of whom was fully as large as Cowslip. When both together took a few slow hops down one of the runs nearby, Hazel followed, and little by little they all three moved out of the hall. They came to a smaller burrow, deeper underground. Evidently this belonged to the couple, for they settled down as though at home, and made no objection when Hazel did the same. Here, while the mood of the great hall slowly passed from them, all three were silent for a time. "Is Cowslip the chief rabbit?" asked Hazel at length. The other replied with a question. "Are you called Chief Rabbit?" Hazel found this awkward to answer. If he replied that he was, his new friends might address him so for the future, and he could imagine what Bigwig and Silver would have to say about that. As usual, he fell back on plain honesty. "Well, only a few," he said. "We left our warren in a hurry to escape from bad things. Most stayed behind, and the Chief Rabbit was one of them. I've been trying to lead my friends, but I don't know whether they'd care to hear me called Chief Rabbit." "That'll make him ask a few questions," he thought. "Why did you leave? Why didn't the rest come? What were you afraid of? And whatever am I going to say?" When the other rabbit spoke, however, it was clear that either he had no interest in what Hazel had said, or else he had some other reason for not questioning him. "We don't call anyone Chief Rabbit," he said. "It was Cowslip's idea to go and see you this afternoon, so he was the one who went." "But who decides what to do about El-ahrairah? And digging? And sending out scouting parties, and so on?" "Oh, we never do anything like that. El-ahrairah keep away from here. There was a Hamba last winter, but the man who comes through the fields, he shot it with his gun." Hazel stared. "But men won't shoot a Hamba." "Well, he killed this one anyway. He kills owls too. We never need to dig. No one's dug in my lifetime. A lot of the burrows are lying empty, you know. Rats live in one part, but the man kills them as well as he can. We don't need expeditions. There's better food here than anywhere else. Your friends will be happy living here." But he himself did not sound particularly happy, and once again Hazel felt oddly perplexed. "Where does the man—" he began, but he was interrupted. "I'm called Strawberry. This is my doe, El-ahrairah. In the language of the rabbits, El-ahrairah means Song of the Blackbird. Some of the best empty burrows are quite close. I'll show you, in case your friends want to settle into one of them. The Great Burrow is a splendid place, don't you think? I'm sure there can't be many warrens where all the rabbits can meet together underground. The roof's all tree roots, you know, and of course the tree outside keeps the rain from coming through. It's a wonder the tree's alive, but it is." Hazel suspected that Strawberry's talking had the real purpose of preventing his own questions. He was partly irritated, and partly mystified. "Never mind," he thought. "If we all get as big as these chaps, we shall do pretty well. There must be some good food round here somewhere. His doe's a beautiful creature too. Perhaps there are some more like her in the warren." Strawberry moved out of the burrow, and Hazel followed him into another run, leading deeper down below the wood. It was certainly a warren to admire. Sometimes when they crossed a run that led upwards to a hole, he could hear the rain outside still falling in the night, but although it had been raining for several hours, there was not the least damp or cold either in the deep runs or in the many burrows that they passed. Both the drainage and the ventilation were better than he had been accustomed to. Here and there other rabbits were on the move. Once they came upon Acorn, who was evidently being taken on a tour of the same kind. "Very friendly, aren't they?" he said to Hazel as they passed one another. "I never dreamed we'd reach a place like this. You've got wonderful judgment, Hazel." Strawberry waited politely for him to finish speaking, and Hazel could not help feeling pleased that he must have heard. At last, after skirting carefully around some openings from which there was a distinct smell of rats, they halted in a kind of pit. A steep tunnel led up into the air. Rabbit runs tend to be bow-shaped, but this was straight, so that above them, through the mouth of the hole, Hazel could see leaves against the night sky. He realized that one wall of the pit was convex and made of some hard substance. He sniffed at it uncertainly. "Don't you know what those are?" said Strawberry. "They're bricks, the stones that men make their houses and barns out of. There used to be a well here long ago, but it's filled up now. The men don't use it anymore. That is the outer side of the well shaft. And this earth wall here is completely flat because of some man thing fixed behind it in the ground. But I'm not sure what." "There's something stuck on it," said Hazel. "Why, the stones, pushed into the surface. But what for?" "Do you like it?" asked Strawberry. Hazel puzzled over the stones. They were all the same size and pushed at regular intervals into the soil. He could make nothing of them. "What are they for?" he asked again. "It's El-ahrairah," said Strawberry. "A rabbit called Laburnum did it some time ago now. We have others, but this is the best. Worth a visit, don't you think?" Hazel was more at a loss than ever. He had never seen a laburnum and was puzzled by the name, which in Lapin is poison tree. How could a rabbit be called poison? And how could stones be El-ahrairah? What exactly was it that Strawberry was saying was El-ahrairah? In confusion, he said, "I don't understand." "It's what we call a shape," explained Strawberry. "Haven't you seen one before? The stones make the shape of El-ahrairah on the wall, stealing the king's lettuce. You know." Hazel had not felt so much bewildered since Blackberry had talked about the raft beside the Enborn. Obviously, the stones could not possibly be anything to do with El-ahrairah. It seemed to him that Strawberry might as well have said that his tail was an oak tree. He sniffed again, and then put a paw up to the wall. "Steady, steady," said Strawberry. "You might damage it, and that wouldn't do." "Never mind. We'll come again some other time." "But where are—" Hazel was beginning when Strawberry once more interrupted him. "I expect you'll be hungry now. I know I am. It's going on raining all night, I'm certain of that, but we can feed underground here, you know. And then you can sleep in the Great Burrow, or in my place if you prefer. We can go back more quickly than we came. There's a run that goes almost straight. Actually, it passes across—" He chatted on relentlessly as they made their way back. It suddenly occurred to Hazel that these desperate interruptions seemed to follow any question beginning, "Where?" He thought he would put this to the proof. After a while, Strawberry ended by saying, "We're nearly at the Great Burrow now, but we're coming in by a different way." "And where—" said Hazel. Instantly, Strawberry turned into a side run and called, "Kingcup, are you coming down to the Great Burrow?" There was silence. "That's odd," said Strawberry, returning and once more leading the way. "He's generally there about this time. I often call for him, you know." Hazel, hanging back, made a quick search with nose and whiskers. The threshold of the burrow was covered with a day-old fall of soft soil from the roof above. Strawberry's prints had marked it plainly. There were no others whatsoever. Da-da-da, la-la-la-la-la-la. Very dramatic. You begin to see, hopefully, the kind of drama that is permissible when your characters are all rabbits, that would not be strictly possible if your characters were all human. For example, this idea that Hazel doesn't understand what art is, right? Like this idea that you can push stones into the wall of your house for no reason other than simply to look at it. That's weird as fuck. What's going on there? And secondly, that these stones are also meant to represent other things. It's like, what the hell are you... How does that make... Huh? And you can't do that with humans unless you create a really strange person who has no idea what abstractions are. But, you know, Hazel being nonetheless an intelligent rabbit, Richard Adams can say, oh, but he doesn't know what abstractions are. He can't bridge that gap because he's just a rabbit. And that's really cool. It gives you this perspective that these new cultured rabbits from this new warren that Hazel's rabbits are encountering for the first time are, I wouldn't say developed, but they're different, right? And they're uncanny. They're interesting in as much as they don't act like rabbits, which is very cool for a story that is about a bunch of rabbits. And this was around the time when, in my second read-through, I really started to think, okay, I can see why this is shaping up to be a classic. Something similar happened when I first read Watership Down as like a 10-year-old when I was assigned it by my English teacher, who realized that my reading level was a lot greater than a 10-year-old ought to have, probably because I had no friends and so I could just spend a lot of time reading. But no 10-year-old boy wants to read about talking animals, okay? That's like the least cool thing that a 10-year-old can possibly read about. And so when I was assigned this, I was like, are you serious right now? And he was like, I'm sure you'll really, really like it. And I said, I'm sure I will, when I sneak some shitty young adults action-adventure paperback within my copy of Watership Down, and I read that instead. And eventually one of the teaching assistants realized that I was flipping pages, but not of the book that I was supposedly holding. She peeked over and confiscated that young adult book, forced me to read Watership Down. And I remember really not enjoying it for a significant while. And eventually I did. Now, my memory is really bad, which means that's literally all I remember of my experience of Watership Down. I don't remember the story. I barely remember that there's a character called Hazel and a character called Fiver. But I remembered halfway through suddenly getting really invested in the rabbit story. And I think that it was at exactly this moment when we start to see this other warren, when we start to see more inter-rabbit conflict. And so really my only memory of Watership Down is the fact, at some point, not the beginning of the story, I started really enjoying it, A. And B, there's a lot of blood and gore for a children's story about fucking rabbits. That's literally all I remembered, and it's all I had to go by for at least a decade before I finally decided to reread Watership Down for good. And honestly, it served me pretty well because it's a pretty accurate summary of what the novel is about. There is this element of horror to Watership Down, not only in this blood and gore, but also in this more psychological element of rabbits not acting like rabbits. The key difference being that humans not acting like humans is just sort of a standard horror story. This one, because it's about rabbits, is a bit more restrained in that element, because the thing that is unrecognizable in rabbits are things that are profoundly recognizable in humans. Things like, as we see in this previous chapter, cave art, right? And so yes, we'll be seeing more of that. In many ways, what I'm reading to you is a horror story, but because it's about rabbits, it's not very scary to humans. I'm sure if a rabbit heard it, they'd be like, this is terrifying. And in fact, yes, Fiver, who, remember my pirate version of the story, Fiver was the one who initially got them all to leave Sandalford Warren at the very beginning, because he has a vision. So unlike Hazel, Fiver has this sort of understanding of this idea of abstractions, right? And he would probably be able to understand the cave art in a way that Hazel would never be able to. But we see in this next chapter that Fiver himself is very, very upset with these rabbits, and we're not sure why. But like I said, hopefully, as we see in horror stories, for example, this is sort of like when the scientist character realizes that something is wrong, and he's trying to get people to understand that there is a danger here that needs to be addressed. So let's read through chapter 14, Like Trees in November. And that's in quote marks, by the way. Courts and camps are the only places to learn the world in. Take the tone of the company that you are in. The Earl of Chesterfield, letters to his son. The great burrow was less crowded than when they had left it. Nildrohain was the first rabbit they met. She was among a group of 3 or 4 fine does who were talking quietly together and seemed to be feeding as well. There was a smell of green stuff. Evidently some kind of food was available underground, like the El-ahrairah's lettuce. Hazel stopped to speak to Nildrohain. She asked whether he had gone as far as the well pit and the El-ahrairah of Laburnum. "Yes, we did," said Hazel. "It's something quite strange to me, I'm afraid. But I'd rather admire you and your friends than stones on a wall." As he said this, he noticed that Cowslip had joined them, and that Strawberry was talking to him quietly. He caught the words, "never been near a shape," and a moment later Cowslip replied, "Well, it makes no difference from our point of view." Hazel suddenly felt tired and depressed. He heard Blackberry behind Cowslip's sleek, heavy shoulder, and went across to him. "Come out into the grass," he said quietly. "Bring anyone else who'll come." At that moment, Cowslip turned to him and said, "You'll be glad of something to eat now. I'll show you what we've got down here." "1 or 2 of us are just going to Silflay," said Hazel. In the rabbit language, to Silflay is to go above ground to feed. "Oh, well, it's still raining much too hard for that," said Cowslip, as though there could be no 2 ways about it. "We'll feed you here." "I should be sorry to quarrel over it," said Hazel firmly. "But some of us need to Silflay. We're used to it, and rain doesn't bother us." Cowslip seemed taken aback for a moment. Then he laughed. The phenomenon of laughter is unknown to animals, though it is possible that dogs and elephants may have some inkling of it. The effect on Hazel and Blackberry was overwhelming. Hazel's first idea was that Cowslip was showing the symptom of some kind of disease. Blackberry clearly thought that he might be going to attack them and backed away. Cowslip said nothing, but his eerie laughter continued. Hazel and Blackberry turned and scuttled up the nearest run, as though he had been near a ferret. Halfway up they met Pipkin, who was small enough first to let them pass, and then to turn around and follow them. The rain was still falling steadily. The night was dark, and, for May, cold. They all 3 hunched themselves in the grass and nibbled, while the rain ran off their fur in streams. "My goodness, Hazel," said Blackberry. "Did you really want to Silflay? This is terrible. I was just going to eat whatever it is they have and then go to sleep. What's the idea?" "I don't know," replied Hazel. "I suddenly felt I had to get out, and I wanted your company. I can see what's troubling Fiver, though he'll get over it, I dare say. There is something strange about these rabbits. Do you know they push stones into the wall?" "They do what?" Hazel explained. Blackberry was as much at a loss as he had been himself. "But I'll tell you another thing," he said. "Bigwig wasn't so far wrong. They do sing like the birds. I was in a burrow belonging to a rabbit called Bethany. His doe has a litter, and she was making a noise over them, rather like a robin in autumn. To send them to sleep, she said. It made me feel queer, I can tell you." "And what do you think of them, Hlauru?" asked Hazel. "They're very nice and kind," answered Pipkin. "But I'll tell you how they strike me. They all seem terribly sad. I can't think why, when they're so big and strong and have this beautiful warren. But they put me in mind of trees in November. I expect I'm being silly, though, Hazel. You brought us here, and I'm sure it must be a fine, safe place." "No, you're not being silly. I hadn't realized it, but you're perfectly right. They all seem to have something on their minds." "But after all," said Blackberry, "we don't know why they're so few. They don't fill the warren, anything like. Perhaps they've had some sort of trouble that's left them sad?" "We don't know because they don't tell us. But if we're going to stay here, we've got to learn to get on with them. We can't fight them, they're too big, and we don't want them fighting us." "I don't believe they can fight, Hazel," said Pipkin. "Although they're so big, they don't seem like fighters to me. Not like Bigwig and Silver." "You notice a lot, don't you, Hlauru?" said Hazel. "Do you notice it's raining harder than ever? I've got enough grass in my stomach for a bit. We'll go down again now, but let's keep to ourselves for a while." "Why not sleep?" said Blackberry. "It's over a night and a day now, and I'm dropping." They returned down a different hole and soon found a dry, empty burrow, where they curled up together and slept in the warmth of their own tired bodies. When Hazel woke, he perceived at once that it was morning, some time after sunrise by the smell of it. The scent of apple blossom was plain enough. Then he picked up the fainter smells of buttercups and horses. Mingled with these came another. Although it made him uneasy, he could not tell for some moments what it was. A dangerous smell, an unpleasant smell, a totally unnatural smell, quite close outside, a smoke smell. Something was burning. Then he remembered how Bigwig, after his reconnaissance on the previous day, had spoken of the little white sticks in the grass that men burn in their mouths. That was it. A man had been walking over the ground outside. That must have been what had awakened him. Hazel lay in the warm, dark burrow with a delightful sense of security. He could smell the man. The man could not smell him. All the man could smell was the nasty smoke he was making. He fell to thinking of the shape in the well pit, and then dropped into a drowsy half-dream, in which El-ahrairah said that it was all a trick of his to disguise himself as Poison Tree and put the stones in the wall, to engage Strawberry's attention while he himself was getting acquainted with Nildrohain. Pipkin stirred and turned in his sleep, murmuring, "Sain Leinan Mali," which means, "Is ground still nice, mother?" And Hazel, touched to think that he must be dreaming of old days, rolled over on his side to give him room to settle again. At that moment, however, he heard a rabbit approaching down some run close by. Whoever it was, he was calling, and stamping as well, Hazel noticed, in an unnatural way. The sound, as Blackberry had said, was not unlike bird song, and as he came closer, Hazel could distinguish the word. "Flayrah! Flayrah!" The voice was Strawberry's. Pipkin and Blackberry were waking, more at the stamping than the voice, which was thin and novel, not striking through their sleep to any deep instinct. Hazel slipped out of the burrow into the run, and at once came upon Strawberry busily thumping a hind leg on the hard earth floor. "My mother used to say, if you were a horse, the ceiling would fall down," said Hazel. "Why do you stamp underground?" "To wake everyone," answered Strawberry. "The rain went on nearly all night, you know. We generally sleep right through the early morning if it's rough weather, but it's turned fine now." "Why actually wake everybody, though?"
Well, the man's gone by, and Cowslip and I thought the El-ahrairah ought not to lie about for long. If we don't go and get it, the rats and rooks come, and I don't like fighting rats. I expect it's all in a day's work to an adventurous lot like you.
I don't understand.
Well, come along with me. I'm just going back along this run for El-ahrairah. We haven't got a litter at present, you see, so she'll come out with the rest of us.
Other rabbits were making their way along the run, and Strawberry spoke to several of them, more than once remarking that he would enjoy taking their new friends across the field. Hazel began to realize that he liked Strawberry. On the previous day he had been too tired and bewildered to size him up, but now that he had had a good sleep, he could see that Strawberry was really a harmless, decent sort of fellow. He was touchingly devoted to the beautiful El-ahrairah, and he evidently had moods of gaiety and a great capacity for enjoyment. As they came up into the May morning, he hopped over the ditch and skipped into the long grass as blithe as a squirrel. He seemed quite to have lost the preoccupied air that had troubled Hazel the night before. Hazel himself paused in the mouth of the hole, as he always had behind the bramble curtain at home, and looked out across the valley. The sun, risen behind the copse, threw long shadows from the trees southwestwards across the fields. The wet grass glittered, and nearby a nut tree sparkled iridescent, winking and gleaming as its branches moved in the light wind. The brook was swollen, and Hazel's ears could distinguish the deeper, smoother sound, changed since the day before. Between the copse and the brook, the slope was covered with pale lilac ladies' smocks, each standing separately in the grass, a frail stalk of bloom above a spread of cressy leaves. The breeze dropped, and the little valley lay completely still, held in long beams of light, and enclosed on either side by the lines of the woods. Upon this clear stillness, like feathers on the surface of a pool, fell the calling of a cuckoo.
"It's quite safe, Hazel," said Cowslip, behind him in the hole. "I know you're used to taking a good look round when you silflay, but here we generally go straight out." Hazel did not mean to alter his ways or take instructions from Cowslip. However, no one had pushed him, and there was no point in bickering over trifles. He hopped across the ditch to the farther bank and looked round him again. Several rabbits were already running down the field towards a distant hedge dappled white with great patches of maybloom. He saw Bigwig and Silver and went to join them, flicking the wet off his front paws step by step like a cat. "I hope your friends have been looking after you as well as these fellows have looked after us, Hazel," said Bigwig. "Silver and I really feel at home again. If you ask me, I reckon we've all made a change for the better. Even if I was wrong, and nothing terrible has happened back at the old warren, I'd still say we're better off here. Are you coming along to feed?"
"What is this business about going to feed? Do you know?" asked Hazel.
"Haven't they told you? Apparently there's El-ahrairah to be had down the fields. Most of them go every day."
Rabbits usually eat grass, as everyone knows. But more appetizing food, such as lettuce or carrots, for which they will make an expedition or rob a garden, is El-ahrairah.
El-ahrairah? But isn't it rather late in the morning to raid a garden? Said Hazel, glancing at the distant roofs of the farm behind the trees.
No, no, said one of the warren rabbits, who had overheard him.
The El-ahrairah is left in the field, usually near the place where the brook rises. We either eat it there or bring it back, or both. But we'll have to bring some back today. The rain was so bad last night that no one went out, and we ate almost everything in the warren.
The brook ran through the hedgerow, and there was a cattle wade in the gap. After the rain, the edges were a swamp, with water standing in every hoofprint. The rabbits gave them a wide berth, and came through by another gap further up, close to the gnarled trunk of an old crab-apple tree. Beyond, surrounding a thicket of rushes, stood an enclosure of posts and rails half as high as a man. Inside it, the kingcups bloomed, and the brook whelmed up from its source. On the pasture nearby, Hazel could see scattered, russet and orange-colored fragments, some with feathery, light green foliage showing up against the darker grass. They gave off a pungent, horsey smell as if freshly cut. It attracted him. He began to salivate, stopping only to pass Hraka. Cowslip, coming up nearby, turned towards him with his unnatural smile,
But now Hazel, in his eagerness, paid no attention. Powerfully drawn, he ran out of the hedgerow towards the scattered ground. He came to one of the fragments, sniffed it, and tasted it. It was carrot. Hazel had eaten various roots in his life, but only once before had he tasted carrot, when a cart horse had split a nosebag near the home warren. These were old carrots, some half-eaten already by mice or fly, but to the rabbits they were redolent with luxury, a feast to drive all other feelings out of mind. Hazel sat nibbling and biting, the rich, full taste of the cultivated roots filling him with a wave of pleasure. He hopped about the grass, gnawing one piece after another, eating the green tops along with the slices. No one interrupted him. There seemed to be plenty for all. From time to time, instinctively, he looked up and sniffed the wind, but his caution was half-hearted. If Elil come, let them, he thought. I'll fight the lot. I couldn't run anyway. What a country! What a warren! No wonder they're all as big as hares and smell like princes. Hello, Pipkin! Fill yourself up to the ears. No more shivering on the banks of streams for you, old chap. You won't know how to shiver in a week or two, said Hawkbit with his mouth full. I feel so much better for this. I'd follow you anywhere, Hazel. I wasn't myself in the heather that night. It's bad when you know you can't get underground. I hope you understand. It's all forgotten, answered Hazel. I'd better ask Cowslip what we're supposed to do about taking some of this stuff back to the warren. He found Cowslip near the spring. He had evidently finished feeding, and was washing his face with his front paws. Are there roots here every day? Asked Hazel. Where? He checked himself just in time. I'm learning, he thought. Well, not always roots, replied Cowslip. These are last year's, as you'll have noticed. I suppose the remains are being cleared out. It may be anything. Roots, green stuff, old apples, it all depends. Sometimes there's nothing at all, especially in good summer weather. But in hard weather, in winter, there's nearly always something. Big roots, usually, or kale, or sometimes corn. We eat that too, you know. The food is no problem, then. The whole place ought to be full of rabbits. I suppose, if you really have finished, interrupted Cowslip. And there's no hurry. Do take your time. You could try carrying. It's easy with these roots, easier than anything except lettuce. You simply bite on one, take it back to the warren, and put it in the great burrow. I generally take 2 at a time, but then I've had a lot of practice. Rabbits don't usually carry food, I know, but you'll learn. It's useful to have a store. The does need some for their young when they're getting bigger, and it's particularly convenient for all of us in bad weather. Come back with me, and I'll help you if you find the carrying difficult at first. It took Hazel some trouble to learn to grip half a carrot in his mouth and carry it, like a dog, across the field and back to the warren. He had to put it down several times, but Cowslip was encouraging, and he was determined to keep up his position as the resourceful leader of the newcomers. At his suggestion, they both waited at the mouth of one of the larger holes to see how his companions were shaping. They all seemed to be making an effort and doing their best, although the smaller rabbits, especially Pipkin, clearly found the task an awkward one. Cheer up, Pipkin, said Hazel. Think how much you'll enjoy eating it tonight. Anyway, I'm sure Fiver must find it as hard as you. He's just as small. I don't know where he is, said Pipkin. Have you seen him? Now that Hazel thought about it, he had not. He became a little anxious, and as he returned across the field with Cowslip, did his best to explain something of Fiver's peculiar temperament. I do hope he's all right, he said. I think perhaps I'll go and look for him when we've carried this next lot. Have you any idea where he might be? He waited for Cowslip to reply, but he was disappointed. After a few moments, Cowslip said, Look, do you see those jackdaws hanging around the carrots? They've been a nuisance for several days now. I must get someone to try to keep them off until we've finished carrying. But they're really too big for a rabbit to tackle. Now, sparrows? What's that got to do with Fiver? Asked Hazel sharply. In fact, said Cowslip, breaking into a run, I'll go myself. But he did not engage the jackdaws, and Hazel saw him pick another carrot and start back with it. Annoyed, he joined Buckthorn and Dandelion, and the 3 of them returned together. As they came up to the warren bank, he suddenly caught sight of Fiver. He was sitting half concealed under the low spread of a yew tree on the edge of the copse, some way from the holes of the warren. Putting down his carrot, Hazel ran across, scrambled up the bank, and joined him on the bare ground under the low, close boughs. Fiver said nothing, and continued to stare over the field. "Aren't you coming to learn to carry, Fiver?" asked Hazel at length. "It's not too difficult once you get the hang of it." "I'll have nothing to do with it," answered Fiver in a low voice. "Dogs. You're like dogs carrying sticks." "Fiver! Are you trying to make me angry? I'm not going to get angry because you call me stupid names, but you're letting the others do all the work." "I'm the one who ought to get angry," said Fiver. "But I'm no good at it, that's the trouble. Why should they listen to me? Half of them think I'm mad. You're to blame, Hazel, because you know I'm not, and still you won't listen."
"So, you don't like this warren any better even now? Well, I think you're wrong. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes. Why shouldn't you make a mistake like everybody else?
Hawkbit was wrong in the heather, and you're wrong now. Those are rabbits down there, trotting along like a lot of squirrels with nuts. How can that be right?"
"Well, I'd say they've copied a good idea from the squirrels, and that makes them better rabbits."
"Do you suppose the man, whoever he is, puts the roots out there because he has a kind heart? What's he up to?"
"He's just throwing away rubbish. How many rabbits have had a good meal off of men's rubbish heaps? Shot lettuces, old turnips, you know we all do when we can. It's not poisoned, Fiver, I can tell you that. And if he wanted to shoot rabbits, he's had plenty of chances this morning, but he hasn't done it." Fiver seemed to grow even smaller as he flattened himself on the hard earth.
"I'm a fool to try to argue," he said miserably.
"Hazel, dear old Hazel.
It's simply that I know there's something unnatural and evil twisted all round this place. I don't know what it is, so no wonder I can't talk about it. I keep getting near it, though. You know how you can poke your nose against wire netting and push it up against an apple tree, but you still can't bite the bark because of the wire. I'm close to this, whatever it is, but I can't grip it if I sit here alone. I may reach it yet."
"Fiver, why not do as I say? Have a meal on those roots and then go underground and sleep. You'll feel all the better for it."
"I tell you I'll have nothing to do with the place," said Fiver. "As for going underground, I'd rather go back over the heather. The roof of that hall is made of bones."
No, tree roots.
"But after all, you were underground all night."
"I wasn't," said Fiver. "What? Where were you then?"
"Here."
"All night?"
"Yes. A yew tree gives good shelter, you know." Hazel was now seriously worried. If Fiver's horrors had kept him above ground all night in the rain, oblivious of cold and prowling El-ahrairah, then clearly it was not going to be easy to talk him out of them. He was silent for some time. At last he said, "What a shame. I still think you'd do better to come and join us, but I'll let you alone now, and come and see how you're feeling later. Don't go eating the yew tree either." Fiver made no reply, and Hazel went back to the field. The day was certainly not one to encourage foreboding. By Nifrith it was so hot that the lower part of the field was humid. The air was heavy with thick herbal smells, as though it were already late June. The water mint and marjoram, not yet flowering, gave off scent from their leaves, and here and there an early meadow sweet stood in bloom. The chiff-chaff was busy all morning, high in a silver birch near the abandoned holes across the dip, and from deep in the copse, somewhere by the disused well, came the beautiful song of the blackcap. By early afternoon there was a stillness of heat, and a herd of cows from the higher fields slowly grazed their way down into the shade. Only a few of the rabbits remained above ground. Almost all were asleep in the burrows. But still, Fiver sat alone under the yew tree. In the early evening, Hazel sought out Bigwig, and together they ventured into the copse behind the warren. At first they moved cautiously, but before long they grew confident at finding no trace of any creature larger than a mouse. "There's nothing to smell," said Bigwig, "and no tracks. I think Cowslip's told us no more than the truth. There really aren't any Elil here, different from that wood where we crossed the river. I don't mind telling you, Hazel, I was scared stiff that night, but I wasn't going to show it." "So was I," answered Hazel, "but I agree with you about this place. It seems completely clear. This is odd, though," interrupted Bigwig. He was in a clump of brambles, in the middle of which was a rabbit hole that led up from one of the warren passages below. The ground was soft and damp, with old leaves thick in the mould. Where Bigwig had stopped, there were signs of commotion. The rotten leaves had been thrown up in showers, some were hanging on the brambles, and a few flat, wet clots were lying well out in open ground beyond the clump. In the center, the earth had been laid bare, and was scored with long scratches and furrows, and there was a narrow, regular hole about the same size as one of the carrots they had carried that morning. The two rabbits sniffed and stared, but could make nothing of it. "Well, the funny thing is there's no smell," said Bigwig. "No. Only rabbit, and that's everywhere, of course. And man, that's everywhere too. But that smell might very well have nothing to do with it. All it tells us is that a man walked through the wood and threw a white stick down. It wasn't a man that tore up this ground." "Well, these mad rabbits probably dance in the moonlight or something." "I wouldn't be surprised," said Hazel. "It would be just like them. Let's ask Cowslip." "That's the only silly thing you've said so far. Tell me, since we came here, has Cowslip answered any question you've asked him?" "Well, no. Not many." "Try asking him where he dances in the moonlight. Say, 'Cowslip, where—'" "Oh, you've noticed that too, have you? He won't answer where anything. Neither will Strawberry. I think they may be nervous of us. Pipkin was right when he said they weren't fighters, so they're keeping up a mystery to stay even with us. It's best just to put up with it. We don't want to upset them, and it's bound to smooth itself out in time." "There's more rain coming tonight," said Bigwig. "Soon, too, I think. Let's go underground and see if we can get them to talk a bit more freely." "I think that's something we can only wait for. But I agree about going underground now. And for goodness sake, let's get Fiver to come with us. He troubles me. Do you know he was out all night in the rain?" As they went back through the copse, Hazel recounted his talk with Fiver that morning. They found him under the yew tree, and after a rather stormy scene, during which Bigwig grew rough and impatient, he was bullied rather than persuaded into going down with them into the great burrow. It was crowded, and as the rain began to fall, more rabbits came down the runs. They pushed about, cheerful and chattering. The carrots which had been brought in were eaten between friends, or carried away to does and families in burrows all over the warren. But when they were finished, the hall remained full. It was pleasantly warm with the heat of so many bodies. Gradually the talkative groups settled into a contented silence, but no one seemed disposed to go to sleep. Rabbits are very lively at nightfall, and when evening rain drives them underground, they still feel gregarious. Hazel noticed that almost all his companions seemed to have become friendly with the warren rabbits. Also, he found that whenever he moved into one group or another, the warren rabbits evidently knew who he was, and treated him as the leader of the newcomers. He could not find Strawberry, but after a time Cowslip came up to him from the other end of the hall. "I'm glad you're here, Hazel," he said. "Some of our lot are suggesting a story from somebody. We're hoping one of your people would like to tell one, but we can begin ourselves if you'd prefer." There is a rabbit proverb, "In the warren, more stories than passages," and a rabbit can no more refuse to tell a story than an Irishman can refuse to fight. Hazel and his friends conferred. After a short time, Blackberry announced, "We've asked Hazel to tell you about our adventures, how he made our journey here and had the good luck to join you." There was an uncomfortable silence, broken only by shuffling and whispering. Blackberry, dismayed, turned back to Hazel and Bigwig. "What's the matter?" he asked in a low voice. "Surely there's no harm in that." "Wait," replied Hazel quietly. "Let them tell us if they don't like it. They have their own ways here." However, the silence continued for some time, as though the other rabbits did not care to mention what they thought was wrong. "It's no good," said Blackberry at last. "You'll have to say something yourself, Hazel." No, why should you? I'll do it." He spoke up again. "On second thoughts, Hazel remembers that we have a good storyteller among us. Dandelion will tell you a story of El-ahrairah. That can't go wrong, anyway," he whispered. "Which one, though?" said Dandelion. Hazel remembered the stones by the well pit. "The king's letters," he answered. "They think a lot of that, I believe." Dandelion took up his cue with the same plucky readiness that he had shown in the wood. "I'll tell the story of the king's letters," he said aloud. "We shall enjoy that," replied Cowslip immediately. "He'd better," muttered Bigwig. Dandelion began. No, he didn't, because I am interrupting him. You are hopefully beginning to see the horror elements of this story coming together. Fiver's disconcerting behavior, their weird, unrabbit-like behavior, this constant mystery, refusal to answer the question, where? Some of them, of course, were singing like birds. And Hazel has this really interesting line when he's talking to Fiver, where he says, well, they've taken a good idea from squirrels, and that makes them better rabbits, right? Not only this idea that rabbits can be better or worse, depending on how rabbit-like or unrabbit-like they act, but also the very horror-like element that now Hazel himself, even the protagonist, is acting in this way, is being brainwashed or manipulated to believe what these people are saying. And we'll see more of that, I believe, in the last chapter. There's a very alarming moment where the horror of what these rabbits are going through becomes almost palpable when it reflects in a more human interaction between Hazel and Fiver. And when it happens, I'm sure you guys will be very alarmed. I'm very excited to read that to you guys. But for now, we have this, in true horror fashion, there is a story within the story, right? Dandelion is going to tell us the story of El-ahrairah and the King's Lettuce. Now, for those of you guys who are not listening very carefully, this is the same story that was abstractly represented in the cave painting, or the cave stone pushing that Hazel just couldn't wrap his head around, trying to understand what abstractions even mean. But he realizes that if these guys are making stone paintings, for lack of a better word, cave wall art of this story, then they'll probably enjoy the actual telling of the story. So Dandelion, their resident storyteller, is about to tell the story. El-ahrairah, like I said, is sort of the trickster god of the rabbits, but even more than that, he sort of is like a Jesus figure to them, in that he's the ideal rabbit. He is the one that all of them aspire to. He's like the greatest among rabbits, and they have quite a thorough repertoire of stories of El-ahrairah and how he overcomes many different hurdles. Just within Watership Town, there are the following El-ahrairah stories. First of all, there's a brief story that if I could immediately jump to, I would actually read, but I don't know where it is, where he's trying to cross a river that has a very aggressive fish in it that would probably eat him. And so what he does is he combs out a bunch of his fur and then pushes it into the water. The fish bites on it, but realizes it's nothing substantial, it's just fur. So he spits it back out. Eventually it drifts back into the bank. El-ahrairah picks it up again, pushes it once more. The fish bites on it again. This repeats several times until the fish eventually stops biting on that clump of fur. When that happens, El-ahrairah himself jumps in, and the fish, mistaking him for the fur, doesn't bite on him, and therefore he crosses safely. That's the very first story we hear of El-ahrairah, and gives us a brief inkling of the kind of trickster figure that he is. But also of this idea that a rabbit is constantly bound by mortality, that even the greatest of rabbits has to think his way around all of these predators. And in fact, that's what his name means. In this rabbit language that Richard Adams created for Watership Down, his name is El-ahrairah. Elil means enemies, and you've actually heard me use that word many, many times now, so you'll probably recognize it, Elil. Ra means sort of like a prince or king or leader or lord. It's sort of like all of these at once. A chief rabbit is generally called, so if the chief rabbit of a warren was called Bowie, for instance, then he'd be called Bowie Ra, right? And Hazel, the leader of this group of renegade rabbits, is Hazel Ra. And their old leader is called PreAmble. El-ahrairah, or as it's simplified, El-ahrairah, is Prince with 1,000 enemies. Now, there's one word in there that I haven't explained. That's hrair. Hrair is a very interesting word because in Richard Adams' mythology of rabbits, they can't count past 4. And what you'll often notice when you're reading this book is the rabbits really like grouping themselves into groups of 4 because any more than that is hrair, right? Uncountable, too many. You'll notice that Fiver has 5 in his name, but that's an anglicization, it's an English, it's an English literalization of this word, which means more than 4, hrair. And in fact, Fiver's rabbit name is Hreiru. Now, being named as such, we can derive a couple of things from his name of Fiver's nature. The first is that he was born in a litter that had more than 4 rabbits. It might literally mean that he was the 5th rabbit born, but what it's actually saying is he's not the first, right? And Hazel, being his brother, would presumably be somewhat closer to the first, or if not the first himself. He's not the strongest of that litter, right? He wasn't the best in that litter. But he's not second, he's not in the running for 3rd, he's not even in the running for 4th, right? He is so low that he is ranked below 4th. That's essentially what his name is saying. He is uncountably ranked. That's how low he is. It's like, you're playing a competitive video game and you say, oh, he's ranked like a gazillionth in his league or whatever. He's just very, very low to the point of irrelevancy. That's essentially what his name, Hreiru, Fiver, means. The subtext of this name is that he is the runt of his litter. He is the least among them. That he's not even in competition for 4th place, let alone for the bronze, the silver, or the gold medal. And this is just one example of the sort of depth that Richard Adams put into the language. There's a lot of other words that I really like. For example, machine in rabbit language is hrududu, because obviously that's the sound that any machine makes if it's operated with an engine. Right? So you would expect rabbits to use homophones, whatever the word is for that, like essentially comic book sound effects in order to describe the thing itself. In fact, I'm surprised that Richard Adams didn't write a name for gun that was more like a bang. Onomatopoeia, that's the word I was looking for. Some of the other words are sort of very rabbit specific. You've already heard silflay, for example, which means to go above ground to feed. Obviously, there's no human equivalence because we don't live underground, but rabbits, they would have a very simple word to explain silflay, right? Silf meaning outside, and we'll hear that very soon, and flay meaning sort of edible substance, essentially. We've also heard hraka, which means crap, essentially. You can combine the two to say silflay hraka, which I'm sure you can think of an appropriate translation in English of that already. And finally, there's also this term called ausla, which is essentially like the rabbit council of a particular warren. They sort of help and support the Ra, the chief rabbit, with operation of the warren. If there's a problematic rabbit, they chase him out or else they beat the raka out of him. They're the ones who raid farmers' gardens because they're usually the strongest and the fastest and the smartest ones, so they know the best way to do that, etc., etc. Anyway, so let's return to El-ahrairah, or El-ahrairah. He's got a substantial number of short stories within Watership Down, and I was really tempted to make this video a reading of those stories, but then I realized that a lot of the stories of El-ahrairah are actually contained in sort of the sequel or the companion piece to Watership Down, which was released some 20 years later, called Tales from Watership Down. And that has a lot more stories of El-ahrairah, and I realized, if I try and make this entirely about El-ahrairah, I'll be way too tempted to read those as well. So I decided instead to focus on these 6 chapters that you're listening to now, about Cowslip and Strawberry. Just to give you guys a hint, besides the story of El-ahrairah and the pike, the one where he has to cross the river, there is also the story of the blessing of El-ahrairah in the first half of part 1, and then the story of the king's lettuce, which of course I'm going to read very soon. In part 2, there's the story of the trial of El-ahrairah, in which Prince Rainbow sends a rabbit spy to try and upset El-ahrairah's cunning plans. Part 3 has the story of El-ahrairah and the black rabbit of Inlay, which is absolutely my favorite.
And in part 4, there's the story of Rousby Wolf and the fairy Wogdog, which I could never ever look upon the word Wogdog without thinking of George Harrison in the Beatles' performance of Pyramus and Thisbe, where he's playing the Man in the Moon.
This lantern doth the honoured moon present.
Come here.
This lantern doth the honoured moon present. I, the Man in the Moon, does seem to be.
Who?
Look, you. All I have to say is to tell you that this lantern is the moon, you see. You got it? I'm the Man in the Moon. This thorn bush here is my thorn bush, and this doggy woggy here is my dog. And if you don't wrap up, we'll give you the kick in the eye.
Oh, that's a classic. Honestly, these stories are so much fun, and I'll talk about it more once I've finished with them. The one that I quickly just wanted to have a little mini essay about, because I just can't resist talking my head off about these things, is the one from part 3 called The Story of El-ahrairah and the Black Rabbit of Inlay. Like I said, this is my favorite story, so much so that I've actually tried to write a song about it, and I'll talk about that more at the end of this video. The Black Rabbit of Inlay is a representation of death, which, like I said before, it really shows a familiarity with death that rabbits are very comfortable acknowledging because, they have 1,000 enemies, or a gazillion enemies if we want to be even more literal. They have the stoat, and the fox, and the owl, and the cat, and man, obviously, and old age, and the white blindness, and all these, there's all these variations on death, so much so that they've abstracted, speaking of abstractions, they've abstracted the idea of death itself a level above the natural to this supernatural thing called the Black Rabbit of Inlay. And one of the most interesting things about these stories of El-ahrairah is of their mythological nature. Inlay means the moon, right? And this is contrasted with the sort of creator god figure in Richard Adams' rabbit mythology, which is Frith, right? And that's also the sun. So when they say Ni Frith, what they're saying is when the sun is at the highest point, or as humans would say, midday, it's high noon. And the direct contrast to that within Watership Town is Fu Inlay, which means after moonrise. So essentially what Richard Adams has created is this figure of a pitch black rabbit, essentially a Vantablack rabbit, that comes from the moon and whispers your name in the dark, and you have to go out and meet it, meet your fate, meet your destiny.
Now am I dead. Now am I fled. Oh well, you can't win them all. Tongue, lose thy light. Moon, take thy flight. See you, George. Now die!
And they've created a whole figure just for that. And just on a sense of creating a realistic, believable culture for these rabbits. It's stuff like this that really makes you go, I'm feeling it, I'm digging it, I really, really like it. And as far as me voicing it goes, I mean, there are few voices that make me want to try and voice act them as much as being told that the voice sounds like the voice of water that falls into pools in echoing places in the dark. But that's not the story we're going to read today. We're going to read about the king's lettuce and what El-ahrairah did in order to steal them from under the king's nose because he was very, very hungry. And I should note that although I will be doing my own voice, the whole thing is narrated by Dandelion. Just something you should keep in mind. This is chapter 15, The Story of the King's Lettuce. They say that there was a time when El-ahrairah and his followers lost all their luck. Their enemies drove them out and they were forced to live down in the marshes of Kelfazine. Now, where the marshes of Kelfazine may be, I do not know, but at the time when El-ahrairah and his followers were living there, of all the dreary places in the world, they were the dreariest. There was no food but coarse grass, and even the grass was mixed with bitter rushes and docks. The ground was too wet for digging, the water stood in any hole that was made. But all the other animals had grown so suspicious of El-ahrairah and his tricks that they would not let him out of that wretched country, and every day Prince Rainbow used to come walking through the marshes to make sure that El-ahrairah was still there. Prince Rainbow had the power of the sky and the power of the hills, and Frith had told him to order the world as he thought best. One day, when Prince Rainbow was coming through the marshes, El-ahrairah went up to him and said, "Prince Rainbow, my people are cold and cannot get underground because of the wet.
Their food is so dull and poor that they will be ill when the bad weather comes. Why do you keep us here against our will? We do no harm." "El-ahrairah," replied Prince Rainbow, "all the animals know that you are a thief and a trickster. Now your tricks have caught up with you, and you have to live here until you can persuade us that you will be an honest rabbit." "Then we shall never get out," said El-ahrairah, "for I would be ashamed to tell my people to stop living on their wits. Will you let us out if I can swim across a lake full of pike?" "No," said Prince Rainbow, "for I have heard that trick of yours, El-ahrairah, and I know how it is done." "Will you let us go if I can steal the lettuces from King Darzen's garden?" said El-ahrairah. Now, King Darzen ruled over the biggest and richest of the animal cities in the world at that time. His soldiers were very fierce, and his lettuce garden was surrounded by a deep ditch and guarded by 1,000 sentries day and night. It was near his palace, on the edge of the city where all his followers lived. So, when El-ahrairah talked of stealing King Darzen's lettuces, Prince Rainbow laughed and said, "You can try, El-ahrairah, and if you succeed I will multiply your people everywhere, and no one will be able to keep them out of a vegetable garden from now till the end of the world. But what will really happen is that you will be killed by the soldiers, and the world will be rid of a smooth, plausible rascal." "Very well," said El-ahrairah. "We shall see." Now, Yonah, the hedgehog, was nearby, looking for slugs and snails in the marshes, and he heard what passed between Prince Rainbow and El-ahrairah. He slipped away to the great palace of King Darzen, and he begged to be rewarded for warning him against his enemies. "King Darzen," he sniffled, "that wicked thief, El-ahrairah, has said he will steal your lettuces, and he is coming to trick you and get into the garden." King Darzen hurried down to the lettuce garden and sent for the captain of the guard. "You see these lettuces?" he said. "Not one of them has been stolen since the seed was sown. Very soon now they will be ready, and then I mean to hold a great feast for all my people. But I have heard that that scoundrel El-ahrairah means to come and steal them if he can. You are to double the guards, and all the gardeners and weeders are to be examined every day. Not one leaf is to go out of the garden until either I or my chief taster gives the order." The captain of the guard did as he was told. That night El-ahrairah came out of the marshes of Kelfazine and went secretly up to the great ditch. With him was his trusty captain of Ausla, Rabscuttle. They squatted in the bushes and watched the doubled guards patrolling up and down. When the morning came, they saw all the gardeners and weeders coming up to the wall, and every one was looked at by 3 guards. One was new and had come instead of his uncle who was ill, but the guards would not let him in because they did not know him by sight, and they nearly threw him into the ditch before they would even let him go home. El-ahrairah and Rabscuttle came away in perplexity, and that day, when Prince Rainbow came walking through the marshes, he said, "Well, well, Prince with the 1,000 enemies, where are the lettuces?" "I am having them delivered," answered El-ahrairah. "There will be rather too many to carry." Then he and Rabscuttle went secretly down one of their few holes where there was no water, put a sentry outside, and thought and talked for a day and a night. On the top of the hill near King Darzen's palace there was a garden, and here his many children and his chief followers' children used to be taken to play by their mothers and nursemaids. There was no wall round the garden. It was guarded only when the children were there. At night it was empty, because there was nothing to steal and no one to be hunted. The next night, Rabscuttle, who had been told by El-ahrairah what he had to do, went to the garden and dug a scrape. He hid in the scrape all night, and the next morning, when the children were brought to play, he slipped out and joined them. There were so many children that each one of the mothers and nursemaids thought that he must belong to somebody else. But as he was about the same size as the children, and not much different to look at, he was able to make friends with some of them. Rabscuttle was full of tricks and games, and quite soon he was running and playing just as if he had been one of the children himself. When the time came for the children to go home, Rabscuttle went too. They came up to the gate of the city, and the guards saw Rabscuttle with King Darton's son. They stopped him and asked him which was his mother, but the king's son said, "You let him alone, he's my friend." And Rabscuttle went in with all the others. Now, as soon as Rabscuttle got inside the king's palace, he scurried off, and went into one of the dark burrows, and here he hid all day. But in the evening he came out, and made his way to the royal storerooms, where the food was being got ready for the king, and his chief followers and wives. There were grasses and fruits, and roots, and even nuts and berries, for King Darton's people went everywhere in those days, through the woods and fields. There were no soldiers in the storerooms, and Rabscuttle hid there in the dark, and he did all he could do to make the food bad, except what he ate himself. That evening King Darton sent for the chief taster, and asked him whether the lettuces were ready. The chief taster said that several of them were excellent, and that he had already had some brought into the stores. "Good," said the king. "We will have 2 or 3 tonight." But the next morning the king and several of his people were taken ill with bad stomachs. Whatever they ate they kept on getting ill, because Rabscuttle was hiding in the storerooms and spoiling the food as fast as it was brought in. The king ate several more lettuces, but he got no better. In fact, he got worse. After 5 days, Rabscuttle slipped out again with the children and came back to El-ahrairah. When he heard that the king was ill, and that Rabscuttle had done all he wanted, El-ahrairah set to work to disguise himself. He clipped his white tail, and made Rabscuttle nibble his fur short, and stain it with mud and blackberries. Then he covered himself all over with trailing strands of goosegrass and big burdocks, and he even found ways to alter his smell. At last even his own wives could not recognize him, and El-ahrairah told Rabscuttle to follow some way behind, and off he went to King Darton's palace. But Rabscuttle waited outside, on the top of the hill. When he got to the palace, El-ahrairah demanded to see the captain of the guard.
"You are to take me to the king," he said. "Prince Rainbow has sent me. He has heard that the king is ill, and he has sent for me from the distant land beyond Kelfazine to find the cause of his sickness. Be quick! I am not accustomed to be kept waiting."
"How do I know this is true?" asked the captain of the guard.
"It is all one to me," replied El-ahrairah. "What is the sickness of a little king to the chief physician of the land beyond the golden river of Frith? I will return and tell Prince Rainbow that the king's guard were foolish, and gave me such treatment as one might expect from a crowd of flea-bitten louts."
He turned and began to go away, but the captain of the guard became frightened and called him back. El-ahrairah allowed himself to be persuaded, and the soldiers took him to the king. After 5 days of bad food and bad stomach, the king was not inclined to be suspicious of someone who said that Prince Rainbow had sent him to make him better. He begged El-ahrairah to examine him, and promised to do all he said. El-ahrairah made a great business of examining the king. He looked at his eyes and his ears and his teeth and his droppings and the ends of his claws, and he inquired what he had been eating. Then he demanded to see the royal storerooms and the lettuce garden. When he came back, he looked very grave and said, "Great king, I know well what sorry news it will be to you, but the cause of your sickness is those very lettuces by which you set such store." "The lettuces!" cried King Darton. "Impossible! They are all grown from from good, healthy seed, and guarded day and night."
"Alas,"
said El-ahrairah,
"I know it well. But they have been infected by the dreaded louse-bedoodle that flies in ever-decreasing circles through the gun-pat of the clutch. A deadly virus, dear me, yes. Isolated by the purple arvago and maturing in the grey-green forests of the okey-pokey. This, you understand, is to put the matter for you in simple terms, insofar as I can. Medically speaking, there are certain complexities with which I will not weary you."
"I cannot believe it," said the king.
"The simplest course," said El-ahrairah, "will be to prove it to you. But we need not make one of your subjects ill. Tell the soldiers to go out and take a prisoner."
The soldiers went out, and the first creature they found was Rabscuttle grazing on the hilltop. They dragged him through the gates and into the king's presence.
"Ah, a rabbit," said El-ahrairah. "Nasty creature, so much the better. Disgusting rabbit, eat that lettuce."
Rabscuttle did so, and soon afterwards he began to moan and thrash about. He kicked in convulsions and rolled his eyes. He gnawed at the floor and frothed at the mouth.
"He is very ill," said El-ahrairah. "He must have got an exceptionally bad one. Or else, which is more probable, the infection is particularly deadly to rabbits. But in any event, let us be thankful it was not your majesty. Well, he has served our purpose. Throw him out. I would strongly advise your majesty," went on El-ahrairah, "not to leave the lettuces where they are, for they will shoot and flower and seed. The infection will spread. I know it is disappointing, but you must get rid of them."
At that moment, as luck would have it, in came the captain of the guard with Yona the hedgehog. "Your Majesty," he cried, "this creature returns from the marshes of Kelfazine. The people of El-ahrairah are mustering for war. They say that they are coming to attack your Majesty's garden and steal the royal lettuces. May I have your Majesty's order to take out the soldiers and destroy them?" "Aha!" said the king. "I have thought of a trick worth 2 of that. Particularly deadly to rabbits. Well, let them have all the lettuces they want. In fact, you ought to take 1,000 down to the marshes of Kelfazine and leave them there. Ho, what a joke! I feel all the better for it."
"Ah, what deadly cunning," said El-ahrairah. "No wonder your majesty is ruler of a great people. I believe you are already recovering. As with many illnesses, the cure is simple once perceived. No, I will accept no reward. In any case, there is nothing here that would be thought of value in the shining land beyond the golden river of Frith. I have done as Prince Rainbow required. It is sufficient. Perhaps you will be so good as to tell your guards to accompany me to the foot of the hill?"
He bowed and left the palace. Later that evening, as El-ahrairah was urging his rabbits to growl more fiercely and run up and down in the marshes of Kelfazine, Prince Rainbow came over the river. "El-ahrairah!" he called. "Am I bewitched?" "It is quite possible," said El-ahrairah. "The
dreaded louse-bedoodle—"
"There are 1,000 lettuces in a pile at the top of the marsh. Who put them there?" "Well, I told you they were being delivered," said El-ahrairah. "You could hardly expect my people, weak and hungry as they are, to carry them all the way from King Darton's garden. However, they will soon recover now under the treatment that I shall prescribe.
I am a physician, I may say, and if you have not heard as much, Prince Rainbow, you may take it that you soon will from another quarter.
Rabscuttle, go out and collect the lettuces." Then Prince Rainbow saw that El-ahrairah had been as good as his word, and that he himself must keep his promise too. He let the rabbits out of the marshes of Kelfazine, and they multiplied everywhere. And from that day to this, no power on earth can keep a rabbit out of a vegetable garden, for El-ahrairah prompts them with 1,000 tricks, the best in the world.
You guys will have noticed, if you're paying attention, that I skipped the epigraph for that chapter because it's in Italian. It references an Italian text. Not that I'm not fluent in Italian and that I haven't read the text. It's just I thought you guys wouldn't know it. Obviously, you know, this is that famous scene where Don Alfonso says, "Eccovi il medico, signore belle," and Ferrando and Guglielmo reply, "Despina in mashra che triste pelle," right, from Lorenzo da Ponte's Così fan tutte. Everyone knows that, unless you're some kind of plebeian who doesn't understand Italian. But I didn't want you guys to feel put off by the sudden Italian, so I just decided to skip it and proceed to the actual story, which hopefully you liked. Certainly the most childish that Watership Down gets, but even then it's a sort of joyous, happy childishness that does it credit instead of feeling like a step down in the quality of the narrative. Right? It's sort of like listening to Yellow Submarine and realizing, oh shit, this is actually a good song, right? There is a joy that comes out of enjoying innocent things, childlike things, right? The difference between childlike and childish being paramount. One is nostalgic and the other is immature. And these stories of El-ahrairah are certainly
leaning more towards the former rather than the latter. Some of you may be wondering what even led me to read a supposed children's book in Watership Down. Well, you may know that I've become a fan of C.S. Lewis recently. And the reason for that is because I started rereading Narnia. Now, Narnia, I actually started reading around the same time as Watership Down. I think I finished Watership Down and I was like, cool, I guess talking animals aren't as dumb as they seem. And this was around the time when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was being made into a movie. And so coming to this realization that, hey, maybe talking animals aren't as lame and lousy as they seem, I think I started reading Narnia at around that time. But the thing is, my journey with Narnia was completely different to my journey to Watership Down. Because with Narnia, I remember everything that I read so vividly. The first story that you generally read for Narnia is The Magician's Nephew, which is about the founding of Narnia. And I read that once when I was a kid, 10 years old. And when I reread it earlier this year, it felt like not a day had passed. Every single chapter in that story, every single image in that story, the fallen world of Charn, I think it's called, where they meet the White Witch and how it's glowing red because it's enveloped in the light of a dying sun, and all around them are these ruinous buildings that I saw as skyscrapers when I was 10 years old, probably because I was living in Hong Kong at the time, so the place is just skyscrapers everywhere, so I guess I was influenced by that. But for me, the world of Charn was just these ruined skyscrapers, half-toppled, the glass is all shattered, all metal and steel, and all of it painted blood red because of this eternal sunset. I remember the White Witch talking about the deplorable word. I remember the darkness from where Aslan started singing in order to breathe Narnia into creation. I remember the silver apple in the garden, where he is tempted to take a bite by the White Witch, who has herself forsaken her life, that is, granted herself eternal life, for the sake of something more profound, something deeper, that can never be replaced. Every single part of that story I remembered completely perfectly. And when I went to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when I went to Prince Caspian, I realized I know these stories back to front, even though I read them more than a decade ago. And I remember really enjoying the fantastical setting of Narnia, until, like I said, the opposite story to Watership Down, I just kind of lost interest, especially as the story started getting really weird. Starting with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where they just sail east. That's literally the plot in a nutshell. They get on a boat and they sail east. And I was like, what the fuck? That's ridiculous. And I remember just stopping reading Narnia. So that when I came back to reading Narnia earlier this year, I got to read Voyage of the Dawn Treader for the first time, and it became my favorite very quickly. Got to read Silver Chair for the first time. That's a mindfuck that I really want to make a video on. And then I got to The Last Battle, and that is just so heart-wrenchingly beautiful. Lewis's writing throughout is spectacular. You know, he's got such a way with words and such a brilliant wit. You know, the first line in Voyage of the Dawn Treader is, there was once a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. Right? Compared to Watership Down, you've seen how kind of dry the language is, especially the narration. There's not much going on there. The most personal that the narration gets is when he mentions R.M. Lockley's The Private Life of the Rabbit, which was Richard Adams' guidebook to all things rabbit related, and he used it as a significant reference for how rabbits behave and what these underground warrens look like, etc. And in terms of wittiness, in terms of having a captivating voice, there really aren't very good examples. The best that immediately comes to mind is from the start of chapter 23, where he writes, "Human beings say it never rains, but it pours. This is not very apt, for it frequently does rain without pouring. The rabbit's proverb is better expressed. They say, one cloud feels lonely. And indeed, it is true that the appearance of a single cloud often means that the sky will soon be overcast." Nowhere near as snappy or as witty or as charming as "There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it." It's the perfect first sentence. Anyway, this was all to say that after I reread Narnia, I just had a nostalgic feeling, speaking again of the difference between childish and childlike, a nostalgic remembrance of Watership Down. In as much as I remembered Watership Down, which, as I've already explained, I really didn't remember very much of that story at all. So compared to Narnia, where I remembered everything except parts I didn't read because I lost interest, Watership Down, exactly the opposite story. I slowly gained interest until I started really falling in love with the book.
but I remembered none of it. So, two birds with one stone, I get to sort of re-experience this childlike story from my childhood, but also I get to experience Watership Down for, quote-unquote, the first time. So, let's get about doing so for Watership Down by continuing on to Chapter 16, Silverweed. He said, "Dance for me." And he said, "You are too beautiful for the wind to pick at, or the sun to burn." He said, "I'm a poor tattered thing, but not unkind to the sad dancer and the dancing dead." Sidney Keyes, 4 Postures of Death. "Well done," said Hazel as Dandelion ended. "He's very good, isn't he?" said Silver. "We're lucky to have him with us. It raises your spirits just to hear him." "Let's put their ears flat for them," whispered Bigwig. "Let's just see them find a storyteller to beat him." They were all in no doubt that Dandelion had done them credit. Ever since their arrival, most of them had felt out of their depth among these magnificent, well-fed strangers, with their detached manners, their shapes on the wall, their elegance, their adroit evasion of almost all questions, above all their fits of un-rabbit-like melancholy. Now their own storyteller had shown that they were no mere bunch of tramps. Certainly no reasonable rabbit could withhold admiration. They waited to be told as much, but after a few moments realized with surprise that their hosts were evidently less enthusiastic. Very nice, said Cowslip. He seemed to be searching for something more to say, but then repeated, "Yes, very nice. An unusual tale." "But he must know it, surely," muttered Blackberry to Hazel.
"I always think these traditional stories retain a lot of charm," said another of the rabbits, "especially when they're told in the real old-fashioned spirit."
"Yes," said Strawberry. "Conviction, that's what it needs. You really have to believe in El-ahrairah and Prince Rainbow, don't you? Then all the rest follows." "Don't say anything, Bigwig," whispered Hazel, for Bigwig was scuffling his paws indignantly. "You can't force them to like it if they don't. Let's wait and see what they can do themselves." Aloud, he said, "Our stories haven't changed in generations, you know. After all, we haven't changed ourselves. Our lives have been the same as our fathers and their fathers before them. Things are different here. We realize that, and we think your new ideas and ways are very exciting. We're all wondering what kind of things you tell stories about." "Well, we don't tell the old stories very much," said Cowslip. "Our stories and poems are mostly about our own lives here. Of course, that shape of laburnum that you saw, that's old-fashioned now. El-ahrairah doesn't really mean much to us. Not that your friend's story wasn't very charming," he added hastily. "El-ahrairah is a trickster," said Buckthorn, "and rabbits will always need tricks." "No," said a new voice from the further end of the hall, beyond Cowslip. "Rabbits need dignity, and above all, the will to accept their fate." "We think Silverweed is one of the best poets we've had for many months," said Cowslip. "His ideas have a great following. Would you like to hear from him now?" "Yes, yes," said voices from all sides. "Silverweed!" "Hazel, Hazel," said Fiver suddenly. "I want to get a clear idea of this Silverweed, but I daren't go closer by myself. Will you come with me?" "Why, Fiver? Whatever do you mean? What is there to be afraid of?" "Oh, Frith, help me," said Fiver, trembling. "I can smell him from here. He terrifies me." "Oh, Fiver, don't be absurd. He just smells the same as the rest of them." "He smells like barley rained down and left to rot in the fields. He smells like a wounded mole that can't get underground." "He smells like a big fat rabbit to me with a lot of carrots inside. But I will come with you." When they had edged their way through the crowd to the far end of the burrow, Hazel was surprised to realize that Silverweed was a mere youngster. In the Sandalford warren, no rabbit of his age would have been asked to tell a story, except perhaps to a few friends alone. He had a wild, desperate air, and his ears twitched continually. As he began to speak, he seemed to grow less and less aware of his audience, and continually turned his head, as though listening to some sound audible only to himself from the entrance tunnel behind him.
but there was an arresting fascination in his voice, like the movement of wind and light on a meadow. And as its rhythm entered into his hearers, the whole burrow became silent. The wind is blowing, blowing over the grass. It shakes the willow catkins, the leaves shine silver. Where are you going, wind? Far, far away. Over the hills, over the edge of the world. Take me with you, wind, high over the sky. I will go with you. I will be rabbit of the wind. Into the sky, the feathery sky and the rabbit. The stream is running, running over the gravel, through the brook lime, the kingcups, the blue and gold of spring. Where are you going, stream? Far, far away, beyond the heather, sliding away all night. Take me with you, stream, away in the starlight. I will go with you. I will be rabbit of the stream, down through the water, the green water and the rabbit. In autumn the leaves come blowing, yellow and brown. They rustle in the ditches, they tug and hang on the hedge. Where are you going, leaves? Far, far away. Into the earth we go with the rain and the berries. Take me, leaves. Oh, take me with you. Oh, take me on your dark journey. I will go with you. I will be rabbit of the leaves in the deep places of the earth. The earth and the rabbit. Frith lies in the evening sky. The colours are red about him. I am here, Lord Frith. I am running through the long grass. Oh, take me with you, dropping behind the woods far away, to the heart of light, the silence. For I am ready to give you my breath, my life, the shining circle of the sun and the rabbit. Fiver, as he listened, had shown a mixture of intense absorption and incredulous horror. At one and the same time, he seemed to accept every word and yet to be stricken with fear. Once he drew in his breath as though startled to recognize his own half-known thoughts, and when the poem was ended, he seemed to be struggling to come to himself. He bared his teeth and licked his lips, as Blackberry had done before the dead hedgehog on the road. A rabbit in fear of an enemy will sometimes crouch, stock still, either fascinated or else trusting to its natural inconspicuousness to remain unnoticed. But then, unless the fascination is too powerful, there comes the point when keeping still is discarded, and the rabbit, as though breaking a spell, turns in an instant to its other resource, flight. So it seemed to be with Fiver now. Suddenly he leapt and began to push his way violently across the great burrow. Several rabbits were jostled and turned angrily on him, but he took no notice. Then he came to a place where he could not push between two heavy warren bucks. He became hysterical, kicking and scuffling, and Hazel, who was behind him, had difficulty in preventing a fight. My brother's a sort of poet too, you know, he said to the bristling strangers. Things affect him very strongly sometimes, and he doesn't always know why. One of the rabbits seemed to accept what Hazel had said, but the other replied, "Oh, another poet? Well, let's hear him then. That'll be some return for my shoulder anyway. He scratched a great tuft of fur out." Fiver was already beyond them and thrusting towards the farther entrance tunnel. Hazel felt that he must follow him, but after all the trouble that he himself had taken to be friendly, he felt so cross at the way in which Fiver had antagonized their new friends that as he passed Bigwig, he said, "Come and help me to get some sense into him. The last thing we want is a fight now." He felt that Fiver really deserved a short touch of Bigwig. They followed Fiver up the run and overtook him at the entrance. Before either of them could say a word, he turned and began to speak as though they had asked him a question. "You felt it then? And you want to know whether I did? Of course I did. That's the worst part of it. There isn't any trick. He speaks the truth. So long as he speaks the truth, it can't be folly. That's what you were going to say, isn't it? I'm not blaming you, Hazel. I felt myself moving towards him like one cloud drifting into another. But then at the last moment, I drifted wide. Who knows why? It wasn't my own will, it was an accident. There was just some little part of me that carried me wide of him. Did I say the roof of that hall was made of bones? No, it's like a great mist of folly that covers the whole sky, and we shall never see to go by Frith's light any more. Oh, what will become of us? A thing can be true and still be desperate folly, Hazel. What on earth's all this? Said Hazel to Bigwig in perplexity. He's talking about that lop-eared nitwit of a poet down there, answered Bigwig. I know that much, but why he seems to think we should want to have anything to do with him and his fancy talk, well, that's more than I can imagine. You can save your breath, Fiver. The only thing that's bothering us is the row you've started. As for Silverweed, all I can say is, I'll keep Silver, and he can be just plain weed. Fiver gazed back at him with eyes that, like a fly's, seemed larger than his head. You think that, he said. You believe that, but each of you in his own way is thick in that mist. Where is the... Hazel interrupted him, and as he did so, Fiver started. Fiver, I won't pretend that I didn't follow you up here to speak angrily. You've endangered our good start in this warren. Endangered? Cried Fiver. Endangered? Why, the whole place... Be quiet! I was going to be angry, but you're obviously so much upset that it would be pointless. But what you are going to do now is to come underground with the two of us and sleep. Come on! And don't say any more for the moment. One respect in which rabbits' lives are less complicated than those of humans is that they are not ashamed to use force. Having no alternative, Fiver accompanied Hazel and Bigwig to the burrow where Hazel had spent the previous night. There was no one there, and they lay down and slept.
Whew, well, I have been reading for just about 3 hours now, but honestly, it's been a breeze. It feels like not even an hour has passed. When I read George Joestar chapters, probably because I'm a lot more conscious of having to do this voice all the time, but an hour really feels like an hour, but here it's been a total breeze. Part of the reason, of course, is probably because I love these chapters a lot, and it's been especially cool to see how all these ideas that now seem more or less natural to me, now that I know the horrible twist, the horrifying twist of this place, this weird, uncanny place where all the rabbits are better rabbits because they act less like rabbits. Because I know what they're all hinting at, it's been very rewarding to read it through again and pick them out from the whirlwind of images presented by Richard Adams. Either that, or fans of my channel will know that I'm a big fan of rabbits. Like 50% of the videos that YouTube recommends to me are rabbit videos. I'm especially fond of a channel called Rabbit Island Japan. I think that's what it's called. It's run by a guy who I think just every day goes to visit the rabbits on a Japanese island called Okunoshima, which is nicknamed Usagi Shima. Usagi being rabbit, Shima being island, so literally Rabbit Island. He goes there with a bunch of food and he just leaves snacks out for rabbits to eat and he records them up close. They're very docile for wild rabbits. They're probably just very used to humans interacting with them. Elil, though we may be. Every day he uploads 1 or 2 videos, and I'm usually there. I'm a frequent commenter, and I'm usually there trying to provide some funny quip or observation. Not that it usually succeeds, but I try my best all the same, just because, you know, the rabbits are adorable, and I like talking about them. And adorable in a good way, not in the kind of... There's a lot of rabbits that you see online that are artificially cutened, cutesified. I don't know what the correct verbification of cute is. And I don't really like those breeds. There's just something about them, especially like lops, Holland lops, or French lops. I just don't think... They look like fluffy toys, and it just makes me want to punt them across the room if I ever see one, which is not something you'd necessarily want to feel with regards to another living creature, right? So yes, they're not very appealing to me, nowhere near as much as the much more handsome, elegant, classic rabbits that you would see in Rabbit Island Japan's videos. So much more than videos of cute, domestic rabbits, I end up watching videos of wilder rabbits. If I ever get a rabbit, I would probably look for one that looks just as wild and ugly as possible. If I could, I would adopt a hare, because those things are fantastically ugly. But, you know, that just makes them feel like an actual animal and not like a fluffy toy that I would want to kick, right? There's a sort of respect between living creatures, if you want to put it that way. And I'm 99% sure, by the way, that the reason I feel this way about rabbits is because of this memory, I was going to say trauma, that I have from reading Watership Down as a kid. Anyway, so we've got one chapter left, and then I'm going to talk about why these chapters have been so cool, what the story is trying to say here. I doubt I'll have much to say in the end, not because I don't want to talk about it, but you can probably hear my voice growing slowly more hoarse. I ran out of hot water a long time ago, and my throat is suffering for it. So yes, let's read the final chapter of part 1 and of this reading. Chapter 17, The Shining Wire. When the green field comes off like a lid, revealing what was much better hid, unpleasant, and look, behind without a sound, the woods have come up and are standing round in deadly crescent. And the bolt is sliding in its groove. Outside the window is the black remover's van, and now with sudden swift emergence come the women in dark glasses, the humpbacked surgeons, and the scissor man. W. H. Auden, The Witnesses. It was cold, and the roof was made of bones. The roof was made of the interlaced sprays of the yew tree, stiff twigs twisted in and out, over and under, hard as ice, and set with dull red berries. "Come on, Hazel," said Cowslip. "We're going to carry the yew berries home in our mouths, and eat them in the great burrow. Your friends must learn to do that if they want to go our way." "No!" cried Fiver. "Hazel, no!" But then came Bigwig, twisting in and out of the branches, his mouth full of berries. "Look!" said Bigwig. "I can do it! I'm running another way! Ask me where, Hazel! Ask me where! Ask me where!" Then they were running another way, running not to the warren but over the fields in the cold, and Bigwig dropped the berries, blood-red drops, red droppings hard as wire. "It's no good," he said. "No good biting them. They're cold." Hazel woke. He was in the burrow. He shivered. Why was there no warmth of rabbit bodies lying close together? Where was Fiver? He sat up. Nearby, Bigwig was stirring and twitching in his sleep, searching for warmth, trying to press against another rabbit's body, no longer there. The shallow hollow in the sandy floor where Fiver had lain was not quite cold, but Fiver was gone. "Fiver?" said Hazel in the dark. As soon as he had spoken, he knew there would be no reply. He pushed Bigwig with his nose, butting urgently. "Bigwig! Fiver's gone! Bigwig!" Bigwig was wide awake on the instant, and Hazel had never felt so glad of his sturdy readiness. "What did you say? What's wrong?" "Fiver's gone." "Where's he gone?" "Sylph, outside. It can only be Sylph. You know he wouldn't go wandering about in the warren. He hates it." "He's a nuisance, isn't he? He's left this burrow cold, too. You think he's in danger, don't you? You want to go and look for him?" "Yes, I must. He's upset and overwrought, and it's not light yet. There may be allele, whatever Strawberry says." Bigwig listened and sniffed for a few moments. "Well, it's very nearly light," he said. "There'll be light enough to find him by. Well, I'd better come with you, I suppose. Don't worry, he can't have gone far, but by the king's letters, I won't half give him a piece of my mind when we catch him." "I'll hold him down while you kick him, if only we can find him. Come on." They went up the run to the mouth of the hole and paused together. "Since our friends aren't here to push us," said Bigwig, "we may as well make sure the place isn't crawling with stoats and owls before we go out." At that moment, a brown owl's call sounded from the opposite wood. It was the first call, and by instinct they both crouched motionless, counting 4 heartbeats until the second followed. "It's moving away." "How many field mice say that every night, I wonder? You know the call's deceptive. It's meant to be." "Well, I can't help it," said Hazel. "Fiver's somewhere out there, and I'm going after him." "You were right anyway. It is light. Just." "Shall we look under the yew tree first?" But Fiver was not under the yew tree.
The light, as it grew, began to show the upper field, while the distant hedge and brook remained dark, linear shapes below. Bigwig jumped down from the bank into the field and ran in a long curve across the wet grass. He stopped almost opposite the hole by which they had come up, and Hazel joined him. "Well, here's his line, all right," said Bigwig. "Fresh, too, from the hole straight down towards the brook. He won't be far away." When raindrops are lying, it is easy to see where grass has recently been crossed. They followed the line down the field and reached the hedge beside the carrot ground and the source of the brook. Bigwig had been right when he said the line was fresh. As soon as they had come through the hedge, they saw Fiver. He was feeding, alone. A few fragments of carrot were still lying about near the spring, but he had left these untouched, and was eating the grass not far from the gnarled crab-apple tree. They approached, and he looked up. Hazel said nothing, and began to feed beside him. He was now regretting that he had brought Bigwig. In the darkness before morning, and the first shock of discovering that Fiver was gone, Bigwig had been a comfort and a stand-by. But now, as he saw Fiver small and familiar, incapable of hurting anyone or of concealing what he felt, trembling in the wet grass, either from fear or from cold, his anger melted away. He felt only sorry for him, and sure that, if they could stay alone together for a while, Fiver would come round to an easier state of mind. But it was probably too late to persuade Bigwig to be gentle. He could only hope for the best. Contrary to his fears, however, Bigwig remained as silent as himself. Evidently he had been expecting Hazel to speak first, and was somewhat at a loss. For some time all three moved on quietly over the grass, while the shadows grew stronger, and the wood pigeons clattered among the distant trees. Hazel was beginning to feel that all would be well, and that Bigwig had more sense than he had given him credit for, when Fiver sat up on his hind legs, cleaned his face with his paws, and then for the first time looked directly at him. "I'm going now," he said. "I feel very sad. I'd like to wish you well, Hazel, but there's no good to wish you in this place, so just goodbye." "But where are you going, Fiver?" "Away. To the hills, if I can get there." "By yourself? Alone? You can't, you'd die." "You wouldn't have a hope, old chap," said Bigwig. "Something would get you before Neefrith." "No," said Fiver very quietly. "You are closer to death than I." "Are you trying to frighten me, you miserable little lump of chattering chickweed?" cried Bigwig. "I've a good mind." "Wait, Bigwig," said Hazel. "Don't speak roughly to him." "Why, you said yourself," began Bigwig. "I know, but I feel differently now. I'm sorry, Bigwig. I was going to ask you to help me, to make him come back to the Warren, but now, well, I've always found that there was something in what Fiver has to say. For the last 2 days I've refused to listen to him, and I still think he's out of his senses, but I haven't the heart to drive him back to the Warren. I really believe that for some reason or other, the place is frightening him out of his wits. I'll go with him a little way, and perhaps we can talk. I can't ask you to risk it too. Anyway, the others ought to know what we're doing, and they won't, unless you go and tell them. I'll be back before Neefrith. I hope we both shall." Bigwig stared. Then he turned furiously on Fiver. "You wretched little black beetle," he said. "You've never learnt to obey orders, have you? It's me, all the time. Oh, I've got a funny feeling in my toe, so we must all go and stand on our heads. And now we have found a fine warren, and gotten into it without even having to fight. You've got to do your best to upset everyone. And then you risk the life of one of the best rabbits we've got, just to play nursey while you go wandering about like a moonstruck field mouse. Well, I'm finished with you, I'll tell you plain, and now I'm going back to the Warren to make sure everyone else is finished with you as well. And they will be. Don't make any mistake about that." He turned and dashed back through the nearest gap in the hedge. On the instant, a fearful commotion began on the farther side. There were sounds of kicking and plunging. A stick flew into the air, then a flat, wet clot of dead leaves shot clean through the gap and landed clear of the hedge close to Hazel. The brambles thrashed up and down. Hazel and Fiver stared at each other, both fighting against the impulse to run. What enemy was at work on the other side of the hedge? There were no cries, no spitting of a cat, no squealing of a rabbit, only the crackling of twigs and the tearing of the grass in violence. By an effort of courage against all instinct, Hazel forced himself forward into the gap, with Fiver following. A terrible sight lay before them. The rotten leaves had been thrown up in showers. The earth had been laid bare and was scored with long scratches and furrows. Bigwig was lying on his side, his back legs kicking and struggling. A length of twisted copper wire, gleaming dully in the first sunlight, was looped around his neck and ran taut across one forepaw to the head of a stout peg driven into the ground. The running knot had pulled tight and was buried in the fur behind his ear. The projecting point of one strand had lacerated his neck, and drops of blood, dark and red as yew berries, welled one by one down his shoulder. For a few moments he lay panting, his side heaving in exhaustion. Then again began the struggling and fighting, backwards and forwards, jerking and falling, until he choked and lay quiet. Frenzied with distress, Hazel leapt out of the gap and squatted beside him. Bigwig's eyes were closed, and his lips pulled back from the long front teeth in a fixed snarl. He had bitten his lower lip, and from this too the blood was running. Froth covered his jaws and chest. "Thlalie!" said Hazel, stamping. "Thlalie! Bigwig, listen! You're in a snare! A snare! What did they say in the Owsla? Come on, think, how can we help you?" There was a pause. Then Bigwig's back legs began to kick once more, but feebly. His ears drooped, his eyes opened unseeing, and the whites showed bloodshot as the brown irises rolled one way and the other. After a moment his voice came thick and low, bubbling out of the bloody spume in his mouth. "Howler. No good. Biting wire. Peg. Got to dig out." A convulsion shook him, and he scrabbled at the ground, covering himself in a mask of wet earth and blood. Then he was still again. "Run, Fiver! Run to the warren!" cried Hazel. "Get the others! Blackberry, Silver, be quick! He'll die!" Fiver was off up the field like a hare. Hazel, left alone, tried to understand what was needed. What was the peg? How was he to dig it out? He looked down at the foul mess before him. Bigwig was lying across the wire, which came out under his belly and seemed to disappear into the ground. Hazel struggled with his own incomprehension. Bigwig had said dig. That at least he understood. He began to scratch into the soft earth beside the body, until after a time his claws scraped against something smooth and firm. As he paused, perplexed, he found Blackberry at his shoulder. "Bigwig just spoke," he said to him, "but I don't think he can now. He said, dig out the peg. What does that mean? What have we got to do?" "Wait a moment," said Blackberry. "Let me think, and try not to be impatient." Hazel turned his head and looked down the course of the brook. Far away between the two copses he could see the cherry tree where 2 days before he had sat with Blackberry and Fiver in the sunrise. He remembered how Bigwig had chased Hawkbit through the long grass, forgetting the quarrel of the previous night in the joy of their arrival. He could see Hawkbit running towards him now, and 2 or 3 of the others, Silver, Dandelion, and Pipkin. Dandelion, well in front, dashed up to the gap and checked, twitching and staring. "What is it, Hazel? What's happened?" "Fiver said, Bigwig's in a wire. Let him alone till Blackberry tells us. Stop the others crowding around." Dandelion turned and raced back as Pipkin came up.
"Is Cowslip coming?" said Hazel. "Perhaps he knows."
"He wouldn't come,"
replied Pipkin.
"He told Fiver to stop talking about it."
"Told him what?" asked Hazel incredulously, but at that moment Blackberry spoke, and Hazel was beside him in a flash. "This is it," said Blackberry. "The wire's on a peg, and the peg's in the ground. There, look. We've got to dig it out. Come on, dig beside it." Hazel dug once more, his forepaws throwing up the soft, wet soil and slipping against the hard sides of the peg. Dimly he was aware of the others waiting nearby. After a time he was forced to stop, panting. Silver took his place and was followed by Buckthorn. The nasty, smooth, clean, man-smelling peg was laid bare to the length of a rabbit's ear, but still it did not come loose. Bigwig had not moved. He lay across the wire, torn and bloody, with closed eyes. Buckthorn drew his head and paws out of the hole and rubbed the mud off his face. "The peg's narrower down there," he said. "It tapers. I think it could be bitten through, but I can't get my teeth to it." "Send Pipkin in," said Blackberry. "He's smaller." Pipkin plunged into the hole. They could hear the wood splintering under his teeth, a sound like a mouse in a shed wainscot at night. He came out with his nose bleeding. "The splinters prick you, and it's hard to breathe, but the peg's nearly through." "Fiver, go in," said Hazel. Fiver was not long in the hole. He, too, came out bleeding. "It's broken in two. It's free." Blackberry pressed his nose against Bigwig's head. As he nuzzled him gently, the head rolled sideways and back again. "Bigwig," said Blackberry in his ear, "the peg's out." There was no response. Bigwig lay still as before. A great fly settled on one of his ears. Blackberry thrust at it angrily, and it flew up, buzzing into the sunshine. "I think he's gone," said Blackberry. "I can't feel his breathing." Hazel crouched down by Blackberry and laid his nostrils close to Bigwig's. But a light breeze was blowing, and he could not tell whether there was breath or not. The legs were loose, the belly flaccid and limp. He tried to think of what little he had heard of snares. A strong rabbit could break his neck in a snare. Or had the point of a sharp wire pierced the windpipe? "Bigwig," he whispered. "We've got you out. You're free." Bigwig did not stir. Suddenly it came to Hazel that if Bigwig was dead, and what else could hold him silent in the mud, then he himself must get the others away before the dreadful loss could drain their courage and break their spirit, as it would if they stayed by the body. Besides, the man would come soon. Perhaps he was already coming, with his gun, to take poor Bigwig away. They must go, and he must do his best to see that all of them, even he himself, put what had happened out of mind forever. "My heart has joined the 1,000, for my friend stopped running today," he said to Blackberry, quoting a rabbit proverb. "If only it were not Bigwig," said Blackberry. "What shall we do without him?" "The others are waiting," said Hazel. "We have to stay alive. There has to be something for them to think about. Help me, or it will be more than I can do." He turned away from the body and looked for Fiver among the rabbits behind them. But Fiver was nowhere to be seen, and Hazel was afraid to ask for him, in case to do so should seem like weakness and a need for comfort. "Pipkin," he snapped, "why don't you clean up your face and stop the bleeding? The smell of blood attracts El-ahrairah. You know that, don't you?"
"Yes, Hazel. I'm sorry. Will Bigwig—"
"And another thing," said Hazel desperately. "What was it you were telling me about Cowslip? Did you say he told Fiver to be quiet?"
"Yes, Hazel. Fiver came into the warren and told us about the snare, and that poor Bigwig—"
"Yes, all right. And then Cowslip—"
"Cowslip and Strawberry and all the others pretended not to hear. It was ridiculous because Fiver was calling out to everybody. And then as we were running out, Silver said to Cowslip, 'Surely you're coming,' and Cowslip simply turned his back. So then Fiver went up and spoke to him very quietly, but I heard what Cowslip answered. He said, 'Hills or inlay,
It's all one to me where you go. You hold your tongue. And then he struck at Fiver and scratched his ear.
I'll kill him, gasped a low, choking voice behind them. They all leapt round. Bigwig had raised his head and was supporting himself on his forepaws alone. His body was twisted, and his hind parts and back legs still lay along the ground. His eyes were open, but his face was such a fearful mask of blood, foam, vomit, and earth that he looked more like some demon creature than a rabbit. The immediate sight of him, which should have filled them with relief and joy, brought only terror. They cringed away, and none said a word. I'll kill him, repeated Bigwig, spluttering through his fouled whiskers and clotted fur. Help me rot you! Can't anyone get this stinking wire off me? He struggled, dragging his hind legs. Then he fell again and crawled forward, trailing the wire through the grass with the broken pegs snickering behind it. Let him alone, cried Hazel, for now they were all pressing forward to help him. Do you want to kill him? Let him rest. Let him breathe. No, not rest, panted Bigwig. I'm all right. As he spoke, he fell again and immediately struggled up on his forepaws as before. It's my back legs. Won't move. That cowslip. I'll kill him. Why do we let them stay in that warren? Cried Silver. What sort of rabbits are they? They left Bigwig to die. You all heard Cowslip in the burrow. They're cowards. Let's drive them out. Kill them. Take the warren and live there ourselves. Yes, yes, they all answered. Come on, back to the warren. Down with Cowslip. Down with Silverweed. Kill them. Ho emble frith, cried a squealing voice in the long grass. To the rabbits, this phrase meant, "O sun god that reeks like a fox." At this shocking impiety, the tumult died away. They looked about them, wondering who could have spoken. There was silence. Then from between two great tussocks of hair grass came Fiver, his eyes blazing with a frantic urgency. He growled and gibbered at them like a witch hare, and those nearest to him fell back in fear. Even Hazel could not have said a word for his life. They realized that he was speaking. The warren? You're going to the warren, you fools! That warren's nothing but a death hole! The whole place is one foul Elil's larder! It's snared everywhere, every day! That explains everything! Everything that's happened since we came here! He sat still, and his words seemed to come crawling up the sunlight over the grass. Listen, Dandelion. You're fond of stories, aren't you? Well, I'll tell you one. Yes, one for El-ahrairah to cry at. Once there was a fine warren on the edge of a wood, overlooking the meadows of a farm. It was big, full of rabbits, and then one day the white blindness came and the rabbits fell sick and died. But a few survived, as they always do. The warren became almost empty, and one day the farmer thought, I could increase those rabbits. Make them part of my farm, their meat, their skins. Why should I bother to keep rabbits in hutches? They'll do very well where they are. He began to shoot all Elil, Lendri, Homba, Stoat, Owl. He put out food for the rabbits, but not too near the warren. For his purpose, they had to become accustomed to going about in the fields and the wood. And then he snared them. Not too many as he wanted, and not as many as would frighten them all away or destroy the warren. Well, they grew big and strong and healthy, for he saw to it that they had all of the best, particularly in winter, and nothing to fear except the running knot in the hedge gap and the wood path. So they lived as he wanted them to live, and all the time there were a few who disappeared. The rabbits became strange in many ways, different from other rabbits.
They knew well enough what was happening, but even to themselves they pretended that all was well, for the food was good, and they were protected, and they had nothing to fear but the one fear. And that struck here and there, never enough at a time to drive them away. They forgot the ways of wild rabbits. They forgot El-ahrairah, for what use had they for tricks and cunning, living in the enemy's warren and paying his price. They found out other marvelous arts to take the place of tricks and old stories. They danced in ceremonious greeting. They sang songs like the birds, made shapes on the walls. And though these could help them not at all, yet they passed the time and enabled them to tell themselves that they were splendid fellows, the very flower of rabbitry, cleverer than magpies. They had no chief rabbit. No, how could they? For a chief rabbit must be El-ahrairah to his warren and keep them from death, and here there was no death but one. And what chief rabbit could have an answer to that? Instead, Freeth sent them strange singers, beautiful and sick, like oak apples, like robin's pincushions on the wild rose. And since they could not bear the truth, these singers, who might in some other place have been wise, were squeezed under the terrible weight of the warren's secret until they gulped out fine folly about dignity and acquiescence and anything else that could make believe that the rabbits loved the shining wire. But one strict rule they had. Oh, yes, the strictest. No one must ever ask where another rabbit was, and anyone who asked where was bad enough. But to speak openly of the wires, that was intolerable, for that they would scratch and kill. He stopped. No one moved. Then, in the silence, Bigwig lurched to his feet, swayed a moment, tottered a few steps towards Fiver, and fell again. Fiver paid him no heed, but looked from one to another among the rabbits. Then he began speaking again. And then we came over the heather in the night, wild rabbits making scrapes across the valley. The warren rabbits didn't show themselves at once. They needed to think what was best to be done, but they hit on it quite soon. To bring us into the warren and tell us nothing. Don't you see? The farmer only sets so many snares at a time, and if one rabbit dies, the others will live that much longer. You suggested that Hazel should tell them our adventures, Blackberry, but it didn't go down well, did it? Who wants to hear about brave deeds when he's ashamed of his own? And who likes an open, honest tale from someone he's deceiving? Do you want me to go on? I tell you every single thing that's happened fits like a bee in a foxglove. And kill them, you say, and help ourselves to the great burrow? We shall help ourselves to a roof of bones hung with shining wires. Help ourselves to misery and death. Fiver sank down into the grass. Bigwig, still trailing his horrible smooth peg, staggered up to him and touched his nose with his own. I'm still alive, Fiver, he said. So are all of us. You've bitten through a bigger peg than this one I'm dragging. Tell us what to do. Do? Replied Fiver. Why go? Now? I told Cowslip we were going before I left the burrow. Where? Said Bigwig. But it was Hazel who answered. To the hills. South of them, the ground rose gently away from the brook. Along the crest was the line of a cart track, and beyond, a copse. Hazel turned towards it, and the rest began to follow him up the slope in ones and twos. What about the wire, Bigwig? Said Silver. The peg will catch and tighten it again.
No, it's loose now, said Bigwig. I could shake it off if I hadn't hurt my neck.
Try, said Silver. You won't get far otherwise.
Hazel, said Speedwell suddenly. There's a rabbit coming down from the warren. Look. Only one, said Bigwig. What a pity. You take him, Silver. I won't deprive you. Make a good job of it while you're at it.
They stopped and waited, dotted here and there about the slope. The rabbit who was coming was running in a curious, headlong manner. Once he ran straight into a thick-stemmed thistle, knocking himself sideways and rolling over and over. But he got up and came blundering on towards them. "Is it the white blindness?" said Buckthorn. "He's not looking where he's going." "Frith forbid," said Blackberry. "Shall we run away?" "No, he couldn't run like that with the white blindness," said Hazel. "Whatever ails him, it isn't that." "It's Strawberry," said Dandelion. Strawberry came through the hedge by the crab-apple tree, looked about him, and made his way to Hazel. All his urbane self-possession had vanished. He was staring and trembling, and his great size seemed only to add to his air of stricken misery. He cringed before them in the grass as Hazel waited, stern and motionless, with Silver at his side.
"Hazel," said Strawberry, "are you going away?"
Hazel made no answer, but Silver said sharply, "What's that to you?" "Take me with you." There was no reply, and he repeated, Take me with you."
"We don't care for creatures who deceive us," said Silver. "Better go back to Nildro Hain. No doubt she's less particular."
Strawberry gave a kind of choking squeal, as though he had been wounded. He looked from Silver to Hazel, and then to Fiver. At last, in a pitiful whisper, he said, "The wires." Silver was about to answer, but Hazel spoke first. "You can come with us," he said. "Don't say any more." Poor fellow. A few minutes later, the rabbits had crossed the cart track and vanished into the copse beyond. A magpie, seeing some light-colored object conspicuous on the empty slope, flew closer to look, but all that lay there was a splintered peg and a twisted length of wire. The end. Man, so that is, of course, the terrifying revelation of the cultured warren. They are slaves. They are not rabbits, they are cattle. And they have deceived themselves, they have lied, and they have forgone the greatest emotions a rabbit can have. They have forgone brotherly love. They have forgotten compassion. They have forgotten the thrill of a trick, of a raid on a farm, of what it means to be a good rabbit, to be like El-ahrairah, because they wanted to be better rabbits, the ones that live in comfort and idle pleasure, hedonists, with nothing better to do than to entertain themselves in mockeries of their own nature, just to distract themselves from the despair of denying who they are and what they really believe and what they really want. It's a beautiful, beautiful story, and I love it greatly. There's a lot of parallels to me, personally, to what happened, for example, in the Soviet Union. I read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago from time to time, as you would expect from someone who also enjoys reading Jordan Peterson. Even just that is enough to tell you just how easily human nature can corrupt itself through this lie that comfort and pleasure and a utopia can be engineered in just the simplest way, if only we put our minds to it. And that human misery is not endemic to human existence, to the human condition, but rather it's just a sad byproduct of mistakes that people make in the execution of some utopian ideology. And so any acknowledgement of human misery in these ideological utopias is not the acknowledgement that misery is part of the human culture, nor, more importantly, that it is the fruit of this ideology, but is instead simply that people are not following the ideology correctly, which is why the gulags exist. And you see more than a hint of that tragic tale of human folly in Cowslip's warren. And Strawberry, good for him, is the only one who is willing to tell the truth, right? That's how Hazel ultimately accepts him, is because he spoke the unspeakable truth. And that's something, you live in the Soviet Union. You cannot speak the truth, right? That's the one thing you cannot do. You have to say that no matter how much you starve, that the food redistribution program is going just swell. Oh yes, perfectly fine. Hail Stalin. And you see more and more the same shadow of tyranny looming over Western society as a whole, as statues get torn down, as ideas and words are repressed, and of course blatant untruths become the norm. For example, saying that women can turn into men, or worse, that men can turn into women, and that men can give birth. I don't think that's how it goes, actually. I think it's women turn into men, so the trans man can give birth. Obviously it's retarded, and it doesn't make sense because it's not real, right? It's a lie that they're forcing you to say. And much like Strawberry, you have to deny it. You have to speak the truth. They will say that the baby in the womb is not a baby and that therefore it can be murdered. Again, you have to speak the truth. There are no two ways about this. This is what it means to be a human. These are the biological facts of what it means to be a human, in much the same way that it is unnatural for rabbits to be making art, to be dancing, to be singing, and indeed to be so aloof to the death of one of their warren members. Rabbits are very, very empathetic creatures, according to Richard Adams, and here I'll read for you a little excerpt of what it is like when a rabbit hears a story of great suffering. So here, a survivor from the Sandalford Warren catches up to Hazel's gang, a guy called Captain Holly, and his sort of first mate, Bluebell, if we want to stick to the pirates analogy. And Holly has just told them of all the rabbits that were massacred at Sandalford Warren by humans, by a poison gas. And Richard Adams describes their response to his story as such. Hazel and his companions had suffered extremes of grief and horror during the telling of Holly's tale. Pipkin had cried and trembled piteously at the death of Scabious, and Acorn and Speedwell had been seized with convulsive choking as Bluebell told of the poisonous gas that murdered underground. Their feelings were not false nor assumed. While the story was being told, they heard it without any of the reserve or detachment that the kindest of civilized human retains as he reads his newspaper. They seemed to struggle in the poisoned runs and to blaze with rage for poor Pimpernel in the ditch. This was their way of honoring their dead. Right? This is rabbit nature. Where do we find that in Cowslip? All we find is a cold aloofness, an inhuman, or I guess an in-rabbit, repulsive coldness to the very fact of mortality, which, like I was talking about with Inlay, is central to rabbit existence, right? It is the thing that defines them, the fact that they have a gazillion enemies. And just the same way as humans, we have to learn what it means to be a human. We will always be endowed with misery. And men cannot turn into women. And women cannot turn into men. And don't kill babies in the womb, because that's murder. We cannot engineer misery out of humanity without fundamentally changing what it means to be human in the first place. And, well, that's what all of these dictatorships of the 20th century have strived to do. To dehumanize people, whether it's a Jew or just someone who is ideologically bent against you, or even if it is just someone who will tell the truth. On the flip side of this is a character like Sandalwood, that's not his name, Silverweed, who does tell the truth, but he has to tell it in the form of this art, right? And something, speaking of Jordan Peterson, he's a big collector of Soviet art, and he often describes his collection that he keeps in his house. And what he often says is when you look at the Soviet art, and even when you listen to Soviet music, or you read the biographies of Soviet musicians, composers, you'll often read that although they were prescribed a certain character to embody in their music, they would often rebel against it secretly through subtext, right? And especially what Jordan Peterson says about the paintings is they're looking for something more real, more meaningful, more truthful than the lies that they are being forced to superficially recreate in their art. They're looking for something more profound, more valuable to communicate through this medium of art. And Silverweed is just the same way, even though he is not allowed to ask where, he is allowed to bring to light the same emotions of distance, right? Of feeling like you have been left behind by the greater world, of feeling like there's something greater out there, some more profound truth than what you have here in this cursed warren where all you have are lies and misery. And so that's another parallel to the Soviet Union that just sort of naturally abounds. The interesting thing, of course, is that Gulag Archipelago came out in 1974, I think, and Watership Down was published in 1972, which means that Richard Adams was writing about this parallel unconsciously, so to speak. He wasn't really making it a Soviet allegory. It was just I would say a happy accident, but it's that's not the correct word at all. It's a coincidence, if anything, but certainly a very valuable one. So that's the story. We are coming on, I think, 4 hours of video. This will be a nice long thing for people to slowly work their way through, maybe on a lazy Saturday when they have nothing better to do. I do have one last thing that I wanted to show you. I said before that I'm writing a song about the Black Rabbit of Inlay. And I wanted to, but I can't show that to you guys yet because it's far from done, because I want to put a lot of effort into it. I want it to be good, which requires a lot of effort, which requires a lot of time. So it's far from finished as much as I wanted it to be finished by the time this video came out. Instead, just this morning, I sat down and I said, okay, well, I really do want a song at the end of this video. So in just an hour, I tried writing a song with this scene specifically in mind. And because I couldn't spend that much time, which means I couldn't spend that much effort, which means it's not very good. Because of that, I don't really like this song. And this isn't me and my fictional girlfriend trying to emotionally manipulate and blackmail me so that I have some sort of codependence on her and I don't break up with her. No, it's none of that bullshit that I invented for the last original song I posted on this channel. This genuinely, I don't think it's a very good song. Not because the topic at hand isn't very interesting, but just because I wasn't able to put in the effort, the time that I wanted to in a song that I wanted to show to you guys. But first I wanted to talk about the music of Watership Down, or rather I should say music inspired by Watership Down. Because the cool thing is the fact that Watership Down is a classic, but came out in the 70s, which is post-Beatles, which means that the biggest music revolution in the history of mankind has just happened. So people are exploring like crazy all the different types of music they can create. This very much fed into the kind of music that Watership Down inspired. And so if you go on Spotify and you look up certain terms from Watership Down, like Silflay, like Owsla, like El-ahrairah, like Woundward, like the Black Rabbit of Inlay, then you'll find a collection of really great music that spans pretty much every single genre. There's, of course, sort of more classically inspired music, as you would expect from a story set on the English countryside about rabbits, right? Moreover, the fact that Watership Down has had several adaptations over the years, and all of those generally use the same cinematic score of like oboes and violins and all that nonsense. So there's that kind of music, but also there's a lot of experimental music tied to Watership Down. There's noise rock, there's heavy metal, more classical, progressive rock, techno, electronic music. There's even just sort of indie folk that you can vibe to. So I actually highly recommend just going to Spotify. If you've read Watership Down, just sort of searching in those words from Lapin, from that rabbit language, and seeing what comes out. Because a lot of the music from Watership Down is very cool and interesting to listen to. Some of it is challenging and some of it is just pure bland badness, right? Like it's not worth listening to. But if you can dig through that and if you have a decent enough taste in music, then you should be able to find a lot of stuff that really thrills you and excites you. This, in an hour, is the best that I can do. It's called Silverweed's Lament. I showed it to my friend, and he said, yeah, it's good, but it sounds like every song written in a minor key ever. And that's very fair, because that is exactly what it sounds like. So yeah, brace yourselves, is all I'm gonna say.
Where do they go Where have we come? Where can we stay? Where do the exiles find such secret places to burrow? Where are the rotting leaves, our enemies? Are we alone? Where in our memories do we hide our greatest sorrows? Further than this pleasant field where silver wires are blooming, Frith shows that one is killed for duty and for loving. But here is sweet, but here is calm, but one reason for alarm. So drown your questions in sighs, your where's are yesterday's wise.